thankful for this time to meet together today. We pray for Beth Hadley, and pray for her sons Keith and Doug and the rest of the family. Just give them a special sense of your presence and comfort at this time. Pray for Peter. Thank you for bringing him with us this morning. We pray that we might learn today, and we pray that we might live out your word as well in our lives in various ways. And so we look for a real blessing from this time. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. There will be a break, and Peter will tell you a little bit about that. You'll have an opportunity to visit the book table and some other things. So Peter, welcome. We're glad you're with us.
Thanks, Dave. Good morning, everyone. Good to be with you again at Lombard. It's been a while. There's something happening globally that's delayed us from coming back to the area. I forget what it is now, but yeah, it's good to be with you. And just as Dave mentioned, there is a book table out there, and I think all my books are on there, but there's the one that's new since last time is this little one, the little hymn book, looking at the Jesus who makes our hearts sing. And so be sure to grab that if you want it. Our latest prayer card with children rapidly growing. It used to be a diagonal line. It's becoming kind of a horizontal line that's leveling out. So that's all out there. Please take a look. And there are a couple of titles, Please to Dwell, Lost in Wonder, the bigger books. There's only a few copies left. We're right at the end of our time in the States. And so don't just assume they'll be there tomorrow, because if someone else takes them today, they'll be gone. So do take a look and take advantage of that. Thank you for coming this morning. I realize a Saturday morning is precious time, but I think it's worthwhile to do things like this sometimes, because it allows us to kind of do what you cannot do in a sermon. In a sermon, you've got 30 minutes, you've got to introduce, grab attention, you've got to kind of get to the point and apply it, and there's a lot of things that need to happen. So what tends to happen is that detail and really swimming in and soaking in the text can kind of get lost. So if you've looked at the handout, you'll see there's an awful lot of references. And that I'm not going to read every one of those. I'm not going to mention them. I've put them on the handout so you've got them. All right, that's kind of deliberate. But what we're going to do is we're going to take our time to think through the trials of Jesus this morning. We'll take a break in the middle so you can get some coffee and donuts and whatever other drugs you use mid-morning. And also, I've never presented this as a seminar. I've pondered it, I've thought about it, I've worked on it. Eventually, I'd like to get a book out on it, but that's taking a while. But this is the first time I've presented it in this kind of format, so I don't know how long this takes. What that means is I'm very happy for you to interrupt and ask questions and kind of clarify things as we go. And if I sense that we are running out of time, I'll just stop asking you for your questions. Like, you put your hand up and I'll kind of go, sorry, got to keep moving. And I'll get us through it and we'll be done by 12. So I know how long it's going to go. It's going to go till 12. But I don't know, we might have some spare time to kind of ponder and reflect, or we might be kind of moving quickly. But my hope is that we can kind of immerse ourselves and do that thing that some of us haven't done for far too long, which is to turn on our imagination. You remember that kind of childlike thing we once had where we could imagine anything? Give a child a toy, and before they've taken 3 more breaths, they've already imagined all sorts of ideas, right? With adults, grown-ups, we can kind of be so stuck in what we think is reality that our imaginations grow rusty. I want our imaginations back on today, and what I want us to be imagining is that we were there. All right, I want us to try to imagine what it was like and to ponder what it was like, and we'll move through the text and we'll look at it and be as accurate as we can be, but really what I want us to be doing is looking at Jesus and appreciating Jesus. Okay, so why would we want to focus on the trial at all? Well, I can think of 3 reasons. I have given you only 2 on your notes, but I'm going to add another one. By the way, feel free to scribble on the notes, or to make separate notes, or to not make notes at all. I will not be offended. I'm not one of those educators that panics if you're not holding a pen. All right, I'm totally fine. If you just want to have your Bible open, you've got 4 choices, Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, and you can decide, and you can see if what we're talking about is in there or not, and if it isn't, it's because it's in another one. It's not because I'm making it up. All right, so you can do this any way you like, with the notes I've given you, with a blank sheet of paper, or with your Bible open, however works for you. I will tell you when I'm saying something that's new to the notes, and this is the thing that's definitely new, is why focus on the trial. Number 0, all right, that's a new number. Number 0, the awkwardness of the calendar. I wonder if you've ever thought about this, the awkwardness of the calendar. When you're preaching or planning preaching, when the elders are thinking through the schedule for the year, what they kind of are obligated to do is have Palm Sunday on Palm Sunday and Resurrection Sunday on the next Sunday. And you don't tend to meet in between, normal rhythm. And so maybe you add in a Good Friday service. All right, and Good Friday service is a wonderful idea because that gives you the chance to really ponder the cross. I wonder if you've ever thought about that Sundays kind of skip the cross because there's so much content in the Gospels between Palm Sunday and Easter Sunday. When are we supposed to preach that? You try and preach about it in June or in September, and people kind of go, oh, that's weird, we'll save that for Easter. You get to Easter, and it's Palm Sunday, and then Jesus is raised from the dead. But in between, there's a lot of things that take place. And so if you add a service, you'll add Good Friday, naturally, because the cross is so significant. And so the awkwardness of the calendar means that the trial of Jesus, I think, gets overlooked. We kind of jump past it. We know what happened, and we jump past it. Secondly, like I've put on the notes there, the amount of text. I don't know if you've ever kind of added up the column inches, but the arrest and the trials of Jesus take up more than 2 times the amount of text given to the journey to the cross, the crucifixion, the death, and the burial. Now, that's not to say that the cross is less important than the trials. Of course not. The cross is the focal point of the Gospels in many ways. But you can't ignore the fact that the trials are given a massive amount of text. And so maybe it's worth giving them some attention like we're doing this morning. And then thirdly, the affect of the text. That's a deliberate A there, the affect. What does it do to our feelings as we spend time studying and thinking about Jesus on trial? I think it does something for our hearts. And that's to me the most important. Appreciation of the plan that God had and admiration, worship of Jesus. That's my goal this morning. We're taking 3 hours out of normal life, 3 hours away from the news and all the depressing things that are going on, to kind of immerse ourselves in a few hours of Jesus' experience 2,000 years ago. And my hope is not that at the end of it we will be able to pass an exam on the trials of Jesus. No exams today, don't you worry about it. But I do hope that we'll go away appreciating Jesus and worshiping Jesus and thanking God for Jesus and thanking God for the cross, because that's really the point of doing this. So let me kind of lay out the morning for you. We're going to split the morning in 2 halves. The first half, we're going to think about the first half of the trials, and I'm going to call that the Jewish trials. The second half, we're going to think about Jesus with Pilate and Herod as well, and I'm going to call that the Roman trials. So we're going to have 3 trials and 3 trials either side of coffee. I know you feel waiting for coffee is a trial, but we're going to have the Jewish trials, then we're going to have the Roman trials. And so let me introduce you to something that I don't know if you've ever noticed before. The trial of Jesus does not begin on the Thursday night. Okay, we're going to just take a few moments now to think about what I call the long trial of Jesus, and then we will get to the Thursday night, the arrest and the 3 Jewish trials. Okay, so the long trial of Jesus. Remember, the unique kind of context we're dealing with in the Gospels is a country or a people with 2 legal systems. All right, they had the Roman system. The Romans were in charge, and they had the Jewish system. The Jews were sort of in charge. The Romans had one thing in mind. Their whole system was built on one basic principle, which was peace. If we can have peace, then people can travel, people can trade, and we can tax. That's all they really wanted, was peace, calm, taxation. Right? Imagine that, a government driven by money concerns, right? That was the Roman way. And so anyone that was Roman or Roman connected, the four-letter swear word in their minds was spelt R-I-O-T. A riot was the worst possible thing. So everything the Romans were concerned about, the soldiers, the governors, everybody, Roman connected, and the tax collectors, was let's have peace so that we can get the taxes. No rioting, no uprisings, no political kind of tensions, strikes and protests, disaster for them. So they would do everything they can to keep things calm. One thing they couldn't do was regulate Jewish religion. I mean, if you can imagine being Roman and getting sent into Israel or Judea and trying to make sense of these Jews, you'd be tearing your hair out. No matter what you do or no matter how hard you hit them, they will not work on one day each week. The rest of the week, they're fine. Right? And everywhere else is fine with images of, gods, the Roman gods being added into their temples, but these Jews will die rather than let that happen. And so the Romans were kind of head-scratching with the Jews, trying to figure out how do we both keep calm so that we can tax them, but help them not to kind of have these internal explosions. So they allowed the Jews to have their own government, the Sanhedrin. And they had their own sort of religious legal system. And so it wasn't that the Romans wanted to deal with everything. The Romans wanted to deal with as little as possible. They wanted the Jews to deal with weirdly Jewish stuff. Now, even before the Romans arrived, the Jews had legal systems in place. And it's quite hard for us to make the switch between our 21st century legal world and their legal world. It may be that, like me, you've never been in a courtroom in your entire life. This isn't a confession session. If you have for wrong reasons, don't worry about that for now. We're not talking about you. But maybe, like me, you've only ever seen courtrooms on the TV. Very wooden, they seem to be, at least. They're very formulaic in terms of the layout and the person in charge. In our country, the person in charge has a weird wig on, which helps you spot them. Not so much here, I don't think. But you have the judge, you have the two sides, you have the jury, and there's kind of a sort of standard format. It's separated off from society. It's separated off from the police force, and it's kind of supposed to be fair. Does that seem theoretically true? Yeah? That's what it's supposed to be like for us, and that's the way we create fairness. But for the Jews and for a lot of people in a lot of the world, for a lot of history, that has not been how justice works. Justice is a community concern. And so to illustrate that, let me put it to you this way. Let's say that I go outside, and I'm going to pick on something. I'm going to pick on Todd. Let's say I go outside and I see Todd repeatedly kicking the car that I'm borrowing. No ideas, just hypothetically, right? He's just going for it, kicking the car. Today, I would, legally call the police and say there's a mad guy kicking my car, and hope they do something. And if they arrest him, then he would go to trial, he would go to court, etc. In those days, I'm seeing the crime, I'm a man, I bring the charge. And I would charge him with a crime. And immediately others would gather around to be both judge and jury. Respectable people, like not shepherds, not women, not the lower classes of society in their way of thinking, but men. Men would gather around and would know their responsibility. Here's a charge. Todd has been accused. And so everyone would look to Todd and say, okay, well, what do you say? And so Todd would then have to defend himself and explain that, there was a dangerous scorpion on the car or whatever his excuse would be for kicking the car repeatedly. And he would have to explain that, and we would be evaluating his explanation. Now, there's one Jewish principle that is huge from the Old Testament in terms of legal practice. Anyone know what it is? Witnesses, right? How many do you need? 2 or 3, right? You know your Bibles. So 2 or 3 witnesses can confirm a matter. So Todd would not just be saying, I'm innocent, I'm innocent. He'd be saying, hang on, I know somebody that knows the story of why I'm kicking this car. Let me pull them into this. And then we would be evaluating Todd and his witness. Are these trustworthy? Hopefully it's not a shepherd or a tax collector or someone like that. You know, a person of standing would be great for Todd. And if that's what he's got, he wins. Accusation doesn't carry through, charge doesn't stick, he's fine. If his witnesses are weak, missing, or inadequate, I can pile on the pressure. I can keep going with that. And if we decide as a group that he's guilty, he's guilty. And nobody's really going to complain about that. That's the way the system worked. Now you might say, well, that just feels really open to abuse. Right? I'm just thinking of my culture. If we had that system, I know an awful lot of 18-year-old males that would be charging lots of people with lots of nonsense just for fun. Right? The system does seem open to abuse. However, there was a fail-safe mechanism, which is to say, if I bring a charge against Todd and it turns out that I'm just making it up and being unkind to him for fun or for whatever reason, Todd could turn it back on me. And I could end up in trouble for a false accusation, which brings shame on the community, and all the pressure of you guys focusing on him could turn and focus on me. So actually the system does work. And so with that kind of on-the-street court scene in mind, let me ask you this question. When does the trial of Jesus begin? I don't think it's on the Thursday night. I would suggest that it begins in John chapter 5. So if you have a Bible, feel free to turn. If not, don't worry, I'll read it to you. But in John chapter 5, verse 17, we have a really significant moment. John 1 through 4 function a bit like a long introduction to the gospel. We always think of John 1 to 18 as the intro, but actually, I make the case that the first chapter is introductory. It's full of testimonies pointing to Jesus. And then chapters 2, 3, 4 are kind of presenting to us response to Jesus from Gentiles as well as from Jews and then from Gentiles. But they're kind of encapsulated with these 2 Cana stories. But the whole thing isn't really going yet. It's like incidents that are taking place, conversations with Nicodemus, the woman at the well. Wonderful stuff, but the movie hasn't really grabbed you until you get to chapter 5. And in chapter 5, there's this man who gets healed by Jesus on the Sabbath, and that creates tension. The tension created is that the man is then accused by the authorities of carrying his bed on the Sabbath. That's a legal accusation. The man says, don't go after me. Go after the person who told me to do it. That's kind of like when the police find drugs in someone's car and they say, I can give you the dealer. I can give you a bigger fish to fry. Don't waste your time on me. I want to get out of this. And so the guy's like, don't get me for possession and carrying of Matt. All right, I want to give you the guy that told me to do it because he's a bigger deal. And so they say, who is it? He says, I don't know. I didn't ask him his name. It's all a bit strange. But then Jesus finds him and says, hey, stop sinning. Go and sin no more. And then he goes straight off to the authorities and says, it's Jesus. I took a photo of him on my phone. That's made up. And, you can go after him. And so they come after Jesus. And it says in verse 16, this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus. In this context, it's almost prosecuting. Same idea. They're going after him legally because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, my Father is working until now, and I am working. What do you think that would do to an accusation legally of you're breaking the Sabbath? My Father, he said, what? Is working until now. He's saying God is my Father. That's a massive problem. He's saying that his Father is working on the Sabbath, technically a sort of a problem. Not really, because God does work on Sabbath, but it would have provoked them. And he says, and I am working. Like, I'm not taking your charge. I am doing my thing. And so the next verse tells us this was why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. This is over a year before the first Easter. All right, and Jesus is being prosecuted on a capital charge. That's what's going on here. Now, because they're bringing a charge against him and the crowd is gathered around, Jesus can't say, I don't care about you, and walk away. He's in a situation where he has to now speak. Right? He's being charged with a capital offense. And so what he says next really matters. This is not the moment for Jesus to tell an interesting story about fishing. This is the moment for Jesus to go full-on legal defense mode. And so that's exactly what he does. For the rest of chapter 5, from verse 19 down to verse, 49, Jesus is speaking. If you've got a red ink Bible, it's all red. It's like he doesn't take a breath. Okay, so from verses 19 to 29, he gives them expert testimony, talking about the Father and the Son, talking about judgment and life and who's given who. You know, the Father's given the Son the right to grant life, but he's put judgment in the Son's hands. The Father doesn't judge, the Son judges. And it's all very theoretical. And I think, honestly, we study it, if we took the time, we'd study it with the Holy Spirit, and we're wrestling trying to make sense of what he said. If Jesus is saying that in the moment, the impact of that is that people that are ready to stone him would kind of lower their stoning arm, because it's really obvious that he knows something and they're not getting it. Right? I think he's bamboozling them at that point. Even though what he says is totally true, he's telling them stuff that's beyond their capacity. And then from verse 30 to 49, he switches. Instead of talking about the Father and the Son and those who hear, and it's all theoretical, then he switches to you, me, I, you, and it's very first and second person, and it feels like they're getting poked in the chest. Again, if we had time, we could work our way through that second half of Jesus' speech and just see that the legal language, there's something like 50 plus legal terms in those 20 verses. So he's just going for it with all these legal terms. And the amazing effect is, now some Bibles have a title over it. Yeah, this one has one too. Witnesses to Jesus. It's not witnesses to Jesus. There's one witness for Jesus. And the witness is the Father. So Jesus calls the Father as his witness. And then he turns on the accusers and says, but you do not know him. And then by the end of the chapter, he's saying, don't think that I'm accusing you. There is one who accuses you. Moses accuses you. And so that this is a classic legal confrontation. If you enjoy a legal movie, a legal drama, this is the best one, John 5. Because it starts off with Jesus just absolutely condemning himself to death. And it finishes with all his accusers pinned up against the wall and Jesus poking them in the chest. He's turned the whole thing back onto them. Now, that's a huge deal. And I know it's a huge deal because when you go on in John's Gospel, John 6, he's up in Galilee, feeding of the 5,000. John 7, he's back in Jerusalem for the autumn feast. So it's 6 months later, September, October time. He's back in Jerusalem. And he immediately starts talking about healing the man on the Sabbath. This is why you're trying to kill me. And they pretend that's not the reason, but within a few verses, they're admitting that is the reason. And so what happened in John 5, that spring, set things in motion. Jesus was on trial before the authorities from John 5 onwards. It comes up in John 7. In John 8, they pick up stones to stone him because he says, before Abraham was born, I am, plus a couple of other provocative statements. Come into John 9 and John 10. That's kind of closer to winter time. They're going after him again. They're accusing him. There's a legal standoff at the end of John 10 where Jesus quotes from the Old Testament. And then John 11, what happens in John 11? Do you remember? not quite the resurrection, but the resurrection or the raising of Lazarus, right? And that's sort of February time. And that's 2 miles down the road. And there's a lot of people that see it, and it's the most provocative thing he could have done. If Jesus is trying to calm things down, raising a guy from the dead just outside of Jerusalem, not a great idea. But of course, it was Jesus, therefore it was a great idea. So he raises Lazarus from the dead. And so once we get to Palm Sunday, John is really careful in the way he describes it. He talks about the crowd welcoming Jesus, the crowd from Galilee. He talks about the crowd from Bethany that continue to bear witness to what they had seen with the raising of Lazarus. And then he talks about the crowd coming out from Jerusalem, mixing in with this, and the authorities watching the whole thing. And they say, look, the whole world has gone after him. This is out of hand. This is out of control. He needs to die. That's not a new idea. They wanted to kill him a year before. They've been trying to kill him ever since. I wonder if you've ever noticed that in the Gospels. It seems like they try to kill him, but they're not very good at it. Have you noticed that? Like they picked up stones to stone him, but he walked through the crowd. Or he says something, and then they don't follow through. Now, don't take this the wrong way, but it seems to me like even in those days, killing someone was not that difficult. If you decide to kill someone, run them over with your car, shoot them, smother. There's lots of ways to kill people. Once you've decided to do it, it's usually fairly straightforward. Why were these religious leaders so inept at killing Jesus? It's because it was a legal issue. They weren't just trying to murder him, they were trying to kill him legally because they couldn't just assassinate people randomly and then still have standing in their community. And so all the way through, you'll see in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all the way through, there are these moments where the tension is high and it feels like Jesus is about to be killed and then he isn't. And once you see the legal context of that, it starts to make sense. It's like they've got him. No, they haven't quite got him enough. Right? They brought the charge, they bring the accusation, but what he says turns it around. And then on a couple of occasions, he does seem to miraculously just walk through the crowd. Even those you have to kind of wrestle with. And I think that once you see the legal context, the court is on the streets, the Gospels go from black and white to color. Suddenly a whole load of stuff makes sense. And the cool thing about it is that you get to see Jesus on multiple occasions defending himself. Sometimes, like John 5, with massive amount of words. On other occasions, just by walking away. There's a confidence, a calm assurance about Jesus, and we're going to see that as we get into the trials of the Thursday night. Any questions on that kind of legal background, legal context stuff? There was a book written back in the 70s, I think, by a guy called Harvey, A.E. Harvey, I think was his name, called The Trial of Jesus or Jesus on Trial, something like that. Does a wonderful job. It's one of those kind of seminal works that if you're studying the Gospels and you want to understand the trials of Jesus, he's the one that gives you this. It's not published anymore. If you want to find it, you have to look on Amazon. Feel free to email me and I'll help you with the details. But fascinating insight into the trials of Jesus. So, shall we get to the Jewish trials then? Yeah, so not going to say too much about the arrest. Gethsemane and the arrest could easily become a whole seminar. Okay, so you're probably fairly familiar with that. Let me just check the notes, make sure that we're at the same place. So Jewish trials, arrest, and Annas. Annas, he was a character. What do we know about Annas? Anybody got any Annas details from your memory? He was not just part of the high priestly family, he was the boss. I think of him as the mafia don, right? Because he had been high priest. So from AD 6 to AD 15, Annas was high priest. Now, it's kind of weird because the high priest was not a position designed for succession. It was designed for new high priests. Some would argue every year, others would argue less frequently, but it definitely wasn't a nepotistic position in theory. But Annas was high priest, then his son Eleazar was high priest, 16 to 17, then his son-in-law Caiaphas was high priest, 18 to 36, followed by 4 more sons of Annas and potentially a grandson. So from about 6 to into the 60s, there was only one high priest that wasn't related to Annas. Anybody smell a rat? There's something not right, yeah? So Annas was the powerful figure behind the scenes. He had been high priest. The Romans had got rid of him, but he had sort of maneuvered his way into a position of power so that his relatives kept getting into that role. So if you smell something political and wrong, you're exactly right. That's what was going on. It was political and it was wrong. Annas had a bazaar, a marketplace. We know it because it was in the temple courts. So remember when Jesus came into the temple courts, John 2, and then in the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, just at the other end of the story. I think it probably happened twice. Maybe in John 2, Jesus came in and drove out the sellers and, created a scene, and the authorities didn't like it. When he does it again, after raising Lazarus, he's really pushing it. They've got to deal with this guy. And what's he doing? He's messing up the marketplace that fills the pockets of Annas. So you kind of see some of the wranglings going on behind the scenes. By the way, when Jesus was 12 and was left in Jerusalem, and his mom thought he was with his dad, and his dad thought he was with his mom, and there he was in the temple about his father's business. Remember, he was asking questions that were perplexing and impressing the priests. Annas was high priest then. So I wonder if Annas remembered this kid from Galilee that made all my priests feel inadequate. I don't know. Maybe he was there. Maybe he saw him. Maybe he doesn't remember anything except his own bank balance. We don't know. But Annas was upset with Jesus because Jesus had messed with his income. You don't mess with the business that's bringing money to the mafia. Right? It's just kind of a rule. So Jesus got arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. And even before that, I just put on the notes, Jesus accelerated events. It seems that the priests, the authorities, the Sanhedrin wanted to deal with Jesus. They knew this couldn't carry on. He has to be stopped. When shall we do it? Well, let's see if we can get him before he leaves after the feast. Once the crowds are dispersing, remember, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Jews coming to Jerusalem. And so, don't want to create a riot. If we create a riot, the Romans will clamp down on us. So, after the feast, let's get him on his way out. That was the plan. Judas had gone to them and had talked to them because he was upset by Jesus. This massive waste of money in John 12, this perfume that could have been sold and the money given to the poor minus the Judas tax. John tells us that Judas was regularly stealing from the coffers of Jesus and his cohort. And so Judas was upset at missing out on that money, went off and made a deal for money to betray Jesus to the authorities, and on it goes into the upper room. Jesus is washing the disciples' feet. I can just imagine how the love that Jesus was demonstrating was like smoke choking Judas because he couldn't breathe. There's no air in the room for somebody that didn't get what Jesus was all about. He didn't like this. He didn't like the love stuff and the foot washing stuff and the money wasting stuff. And he didn't like what was going on. And so you get to the end of John 13, and then Jesus reveals to Judas that he knows. He says to him, what are you going to do? Get on with it. Imagine Judas panicking, heading out to the authorities and saying, he's onto us. We've got to go now. We've got to go fast. I don't think they were intending in any way to get Jesus that night, but Jesus triggered it. And so Judas to the authorities got some temple guard, plus John's gospel tells us some soldiers. Maybe they'd already talked to Pilate. Maybe they'd already got a arrangement in place. Would you give us a few soldiers? We're trying to arrest a troublemaker to keep the peace. Make sure everything's okay. Can we get soldiers from you, when the moment comes? The moment came, they grabbed the soldiers, they got this group together, and off they went. You got this gathering of Jewish authorities and Roman authorities coming to Jesus in the garden. And in John's gospel, there's that fascinating moment where they say they're looking for Jesus of Nazareth, and he says, I am. And they fall down before him. Now, I don't know whether that was a flash of his divinity or whether it was like slippery ground. It doesn't actually matter to me. The point is that what happened. When Jesus declared, I am, or in our Bibles, I am he, the Romans and the Jewish authorities bowed before the greater authority. It's worth keeping that in mind, because as you go through the trials, he's being tried by these two authorities. Okay, so they arrest Jesus. There's the whole, Peter trying to cut somebody's head open incident, the ear, the fixing of the ear, the people dispersing, even the little detail about probably Mark running off naked. All of that stuff happens in the garden, and Jesus is brought back to trial. So here's a sort of a map picture of Jerusalem. This, I think, is from the ESV Study Bible. And you'll see over on the right the big Temple Mount area. Okay, that's kind of what we tend to think of. You've got the valley down from the right-hand side, the Kidron Valley, and then coming from the left-hand side, the Ben Hinnom Valley, and they're converging at the bottom there, although obviously it's nothing but the city itself. Just over to the right, can you see there's the sort of grove of olive trees? That's the Garden of Gethsemane. In fact, let me see if I can highlight this on the PowerPoint for you. I would go and point at the screen, but I feel like I'd be letting a screen down. So let me just do this. Highlighter. Let's see what happens. So there's the Garden of Gethsemane over to the right. Now, he's got to go somewhere over here, this sort of upper district where, that's not the greatest thing, is it? Let me go pen. So he's going to come into here somewhere, which is no better. Laser, let's try laser. Do you see something moving around there? Yeah, so somewhere in that region there is the high priest's house. So either Jesus was led down the valley here and then up from the bottom end to sort of avoid contact with people in the city. I'm not convinced he would have gone that way, because there would have been a lot of Galileans camping on that side of town. So he was probably brought past the temple and across the top of town, probably the region where there'd be temple workers and people less likely to get upset. Either way, Jesus is getting over to the high priest's house. If I show you the map in this form, you've got Gethsemane potentially coming across here, down through the kind of city to the upper city. House of Caiaphas is marked. We don't know exactly where that was, but roughly in that district. Okay, so he's brought to the home of Caiaphas, the high priest, but John tells us he first of all encounters Annas, the mafia don. All right, and this isn't really a trial. This is like a preliminary hearing. I tend to think of it, again, maybe I've watched too many crime dramas in my time, but have you ever seen a crime drama where the police know that this guy is guilty, but they don't trust the legal system, so they try to speed the process by getting a confession? Maybe in the old days, turn off the cassette recorder and pound his head on the desk a few times, turn on the cassette recorder and say, "Now, do you have anything to say?" You know what I mean? Kind of slip him into a broom cupboard somewhere and, give him a bit of a beating, and then suddenly he's very compliant. That kind of thing used to happen, right, in the legal system. It certainly happened on TV, and it's happening here. Annas wants to take care of business quickly. Jesus has been arrested, and they haven't had time to get their act together. But Annas is in charge of everything. He's used to getting his own way, and so I think he thinks that just a few moments with him and we'll be fine. We'll have a confession, and then we can march forward towards death. Problem is, Jesus has got a greater authority than Annas. And so the text here in John 18, the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Why would he talk about those two things? Because those are the two things that he could get in trouble for with the Romans. Tell me about your disciples. How many are they? Do they carry weapons? Are they a militia? That's what he's going for. Right? Tell me about how big is your army, sir? And then your teaching. What is it that you're saying? Are you saying that, that you're an authority, that you're a king? Are you saying this? Are you saying that? Are you saying that Rome's bad? Are you saying that we shouldn't pay taxes? What is it that you're saying? And he's going for something, either army or words that can be presented to the Romans. Jesus answered him, I have spoken openly to the world. I have always taught in synagogues and in the temple where all Jews come together. I have said nothing in secret. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard what I said to them. They know what I said. Do you kind of get what he's saying? I've always been completely open. Why are we in this little room? Isn't that kind of the point there? I've been completely transparent and open. Ask anybody. You don't need to ask me. Jesus is not playing Annas' game at this point. But equally, he's not scared of him. He's got just an incredible calmness. When he had said these things, one of the officers standing by struck Jesus with his hand, saying, Is that how you answer the high priest? Jesus answered him, If what I said is wrong, bear witness about the wrong. But if what I said is right, why do you strike me? Annas then sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. This is just a few minutes, right? This is just a brief incident, but it really hasn't worked, right? Annas is probably fuming by the end of this. Maybe he's embarrassed that he doesn't have the whole thing figured out like he'd promised his son-in-law just half an hour ago. Don't worry, send him to me, I'll deal with it. Because he'd come up against somebody that wasn't scared, wasn't going to kind of play along with it. Everything Jesus said was true, even the charge. It's almost like Annas is on trial before Jesus, right? It's like the person who struck him is suddenly facing the fact that, well, if he said something wrong, yeah, I should have made that obvious, but if he didn't, why did I hit him? And there's one judge in that room, and it's Jesus. He's got authority, and Annas is probably infuriated. That's trial number 1. Then we come to trial number 2. So Jesus is brought to the Sanhedrin. Now this is in Caiaphas' house. This is late at night. Could be past midnight at this stage, we're not sure. But it's very late. And so a gathering of the Sanhedrin, probably, even though Matthew says the whole Sanhedrin was there, that doesn't mean that it has to be every last one of them. In fact, we know that some were kind of excluded. I imagine Nicodemus. I imagine Joseph of Arimathea for 2. Probably didn't have 69 others, but a big number of them, such that you could say, wow, this is the Sanhedrin. Right? The whole Sanhedrin's here. Wow, what a group. And so Jesus is brought before the Sanhedrin. Caiaphas is in charge. And if you let this play out in your imagination, it's absolutely ridiculous. They're trying to find 2 witnesses that will agree. Can you imagine? Okay, we've got the guilty guy here. Now we need 2 people to agree on what he's guilty for. Anyone, please. Someone must have said, oh, I've got something. Okay, yep, thanks. Anybody else hear him do that or hear him say that? No. Okay, anyone else? And this kind of kangaroo trial, this nonsense is carrying on at length. They're not able to find 2 people that agree, and Jesus has just stood in the midst of it, just waiting. I mean, how did he not make a comment? How did he not highlight the ridiculousness of the situation, the injustice of it? I mean, any normal human would say, Do you want me to wait outside until you come up with something? Is this real? What's going on here? This makes no sense. But Jesus just stays quiet. Eventually, they found two people that agreed. And it tells us about them in Mark's Gospel. And they agreed that Jesus said, tear down this temple and in 3 days I will rebuild it. And then the next verse tells us, but they didn't really agree on that. So even the charge that looked like it was going to work actually didn't work. And so the high priest got frustrated with the whole situation eventually. Like, this is getting out of hand. This is not working. This is rushed. This is embarrassing. This is shameful. And so in anger, he puts Jesus under oath. Now, there are rules for how trials should take place. What we don't know is when the rules or what the rules were like at this time. We've got rules written in the Mishnah, which is Jewish writings, from about 100 years later. According to those rules, you had such kind of protections in place as daytime trial, a separate daytime conclusion to the trial. So there's no kind of flash decisions. It's got to be, a night to think and pray about it. You've got to have no physical violence or pressure or coercion of the prisoner. You cannot be offering bribes to witnesses. That's an absolute no-no. And all of these things they're breaking. All of these rules are being broken one after another. There's nothing legal about what was going on here according to later law, and I suspect even their protocol at the time. But this is not a legal trial. This is a we've got to get this done, expedient kind of a trial. And so they're doing all these things, breaking all these rules. What it should be is a accusation, witnesses, hear from all sides equally, impartially, listen to the whole thing. And then when it comes to decision time, they had a mechanism in place among the Sanhedrin that they would give their decision starting with the youngest. And they would work their way up through the age. Awkward if, you don't want your age to be known because you kind of had to declare it. But starting with the youngest so that they didn't feel pressure from, the big dogs. Sometimes in a church setting, an elder can kind of join the group aged, 35, 40. And sometimes the 85-year-old has got so much power, it's really, almost pointless joining. Well, Sanhedrin was like, okay, we've got to protect from that. We've got some really heavy hitters in our older ranks, so we'll have the youngest, and we'll keep working our way up, guilty or not guilty. And they would make their decision, and eventually it would get up to the high priest, who would come last, and based on everything that he'd heard, he would then make the decision. Seems kind of sensible, right? Well, in this case, what happens, the high priest puts Jesus under oath and asks him, are you the Christ, the Son of the blessed or blessed? And Jesus said, I am. And from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. So Jesus is giving him exactly what he wants. Right? He's got to this position where you cannot get witnesses to agree, so he puts Jesus under oath. What Jesus says triggers this little conversation right here. And honestly, if we're watching this, Jesus could not have said anything more helpful to Caiaphas than what he says right here. It's a quote, right, from, where? Daniel 7, verses 13 and 14, which is on your notes. So if you looked ahead, you could have also sounded like your Old Testament. That would have been fun. And so, Daniel 7 quote, the passage where the Ancient of Days is there, and then one like the Son of Man comes and stands beside him and is given authority over everything. And it's a really powerful passage. Sometimes when Jesus talks about himself as the Son of Man, which was his favorite title, I think Jesus is not thinking Daniel 7. Sometimes I think it's like Ezekiel, where God continually says, Ezekiel, Son of Man, Son of Man, Son of Man. And it almost seems to be a humble title. Almost like saying, just a guy, regular guy, normal guy, human guy, right? That's just a man, Son of Man. That's the Ezekiel way in many places of using the title Son of Man. But here, in Daniel 7, We're talking clouds of heaven, the authority of Yahweh, the power and, the majesty and the in-chargeness. And Jesus says, I am, according to Mark's gospel, I am. It's provocative. He says, I am. And, in case you missed that, let me give you Daniel 7 on a platter. He's giving them exactly what they need. So what happens? I've called it the manipulative melodrama of Caiaphas. Remember what happened at this moment? When Jesus said that, Caiaphas tore his robe. He made the declaration so that anyone who wasn't in agreement would have to agree because he'd already made the decision. That's why I call it manipulative. He's like, okay, that'll do. We've got it. Let's go. Was he genuinely, upset? Was he genuinely defending the honor of God? I kind of doubt it. He is driven by power and control, and that's what's forcing the issue here. And so he doesn't want it to then become, you don't want some young upstart in the Sanhedrin saying, well, hang on, technically, according to the rules, shouldn't we be investigating whether he is the Messiah or not? Like, Caiaphas doesn't want that. And so he tears his robe, lets out a yell and a scream and gets all emotional and dramatic so that everybody just falls into line with him. After that, we get description of the physical abuse, the punching, the slapping, the blindfolding. Prophesy to us, Christ, who hit you? And all of that is going on. And then Jesus is put in a cell. 2, 3, 4 hours, not long. At this point, I don't think I've got it, or I guess I put it higher up. The fireside trial, in brackets, at the end of trial 1. Jesus is brought to Annas and then across the courtyard to Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin. In the courtyard, there's a disciple who's being asked questions. And as Jesus is standing firm in his trial, Peter's failing in his. It's very poignant. I want to keep our focus on Jesus, but if there's anything we can relate to, surely it's Peter stood outside being scared to admit that he's with Jesus. His accent betraying him, his own face as he draws near to the charcoal fire, betraying him to somebody who was there, who saw him cut Malchus's ear off. And to the accusation of a teenage girl, Peter calls down curses from heaven that he does not know the man. And then he went outside and wept bitterly. The other disciples had already ran. They were gone. Peter was close, but he failed. And that, it's just, I think, poignant, but good for us to remember. Jesus is not a hero in this story so that we can be heroes in our story. Jesus is the hero in this story because we're like Peter. We fail, right? We don't live up to what Jesus was or what Jesus wanted. And yet he's going through this for failures like Peter, failures like the runaway disciples, failures like us. So Jesus then is imprisoned or put in a cell, a holding cell overnight, and then we get trial number 3. This is the morning religious trial. So it's still the Sanhedrin, and it is at daybreak. Why? Because they've got to make a decision during the day. And so if the sun comes up at 5:59, they're going to make a decision at 6 on the nose. They're going to hit the daybreak because they've got business to take care of. They're doing a capital trial pushed up against a festival. It's not allowed. And so how are they going to deal with this? They've got work to do. All of them have got their busiest day of the year, but they've got to take care of this business first. And so probably 6 a.m., they convene again. It could have been that they convened in the house of Caiaphas. More likely, in my opinion, is they went just a little bit across town to the temple, into the side of the temple building, and there's a room, the chamber of hewn stone, which was where the Sanhedrin would gather for official business. You can imagine them filing in first thing, and as soon as somebody says, yep, sun's up, okay, let's get this done. That's what this morning trial is about. It's not going to take ages. The one in the night took ages because they couldn't get witnesses to agree. Thankfully, Jesus confessed in their view. And so as soon as they get word that the sun is up, let's get this finished because we've got more trials to go. We've got to convince Pilate. Now, why would they not just go out and kill Jesus themselves? They did in Acts chapter 7, right? They weren't allowed to. There was some limitation on them. With Stephen, remember Stephen in Acts 7? He so enraged them by what he said, which was, I see Jesus standing at the right hand. You know, he kind of, if anyone knew what had happened here, it was Stephen. He was provoking the reaction that he got as well. But they just took Stephen outside the city and stoned him. Why didn't they just take Jesus outside the city and stone him? Well, pragmatically, outside the city, there would probably be people camping. So there's that issue. But more significantly, if the Romans allowed them to do capital punishment, it would have only been during quiet seasons. If they allowed them at all. It could be that they were not allowed, and Stephen was so much rage they broke the rules, or maybe they were allowed to do that at certain times, but this was a festival, a pilgrim feast with thousands of visiting Jews, plus the Italian regiment, plus extra soldiers in the Antonia fortress, plus the prefect of Judea in town. He would never come unless he had to be there. All the extra eyes, all the extra pressure. This is not a time for you silly Jews to be doing your silly, executions based on nothing. That would be the Roman perspective. And so they weren't allowed. They had to get Pilate to condemn Jesus. So the pressure's on. It's daybreak. And so they bring Jesus together and they ask him, if you are the Christ, tell us. Basically what they're saying is, remember last night? Let's do that again, please. Just quote Daniel 7 now, and we've got you. Jesus said, if I tell you, you will not believe. And if I ask you, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man shall be seated at the right hand of the power of God. So they all said, are you the Son of God then? And he said to them, you say that I am. Now, some people take that you say that I am as being a sort of evasive answer, like, well, those are your words, not mine. That's not what Jesus is saying. When a question is highly significant, you'll find several places in the Gospels where the answer is not yes or no. It's as you say it. You say so. It's kind of like affirming the statement more than just a yes. Okay, this isn't a squeaky yes. This is an absolutely, exactly what you just said. Okay, so they're asking him, are you the Son of God? Absolutely. What you just said. And before that, is that a quote from Daniel 7? From now on, you will see the Son of Man seated, now on the Son of Man shall be seated at the right hand of the power of God. That's a different quote. Psalm 110, verse 1. Interestingly, Daniel 7 is a very Jewish, religious type of a sentence. Almost like Jesus handpicked the verse from the Old Testament that would trigger their emotion as Jewish authorities. This one is almost like he's giving them what they need to go to the Roman authorities. Romans don't care who claims to be the Christ. They do care who's seated at the right hand of the power of God. This is more political. Do you see the difference? Both of them are power related, but one is very messianic. This one is very throne focused. This is almost like another on a silver platter kind of a moment where Jesus is saying to them, I know this is what you want. Let me give it to you. And so this trial here at daybreak could have taken minutes, maybe 15 minutes. This is not an hour and a half wrangling back and forth trying to get witnesses to agree. This is, okay, as soon as we've got word that it's daybreak, we're in session. Okay, we're in session. All right, are you the Christ? It's that fast. They've got to get this done. How many people were in the room? We don't know. According to the later rules, a capital charge could be made to stick based on 23 out of 69, or out of 71. So just under a third would be a quorum that would allow them to make this decision. Pretty sure Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea are not in, so therefore 69, but it's somewhere between 23 and 69 gathered at 6 a.m., first thing in the morning, as soon as sun rises, on a feast day. So they're breaking all sorts of rules, but they've got to get things taken care of. Jesus gives them what they want, and now they need to go on. Let me just move backwards to this. Now they need to go on to Pilate. So, arrested in Gethsemane, brought around to the house of Caiaphas, 2 trials there overnight, 3rd trial at daybreak, possibly there, but since they're trying to at least give the appearance of following the rules, I think it's likely that they would have gone up into the temple, and the chamber of hewn stone is in the side of the temple on this end here, south wall. Next, they've got to go back to Herod, who's going to be over here in Herod's palace, not in Antonia Fortress, the way the Roman Catholic Church always presents it, but over at Herod's palace. So any comments or thoughts? We've kind of done a nice fast run through of the first half there, but anything that you've never noticed before, anything that I've skipped that you think's important, any questions, any comments, any reflections? Let's just take a couple of minutes to kind of pause and ponder. Yeah.
In John 2, there's a mention about destroying the temple. So he was already sowing the seeds, really, what later came up in the trial.
Yeah, absolutely. The thing about John 2, since we've got a few minutes here, let me just mention this. John 2 is more significant than you realize as you read it. And let me prove that in a way for us. You know that John loved the number 7, right? If you've read Revelation, let's imagine you're preaching through Revelation at the moment. You might have noticed there are some 7s, right? If nobody's pointed out the repetition of 7 in Revelation, I do apologize for all preachers everywhere, because it's in your face, right? In Revelation, it's also very common in John. John's famous for 7 I ams. I am the gate of the sheep, I am the way, the truth, and the life, I am the resurrection and the life, and so on. There's 7 I am statements of Jesus. Did you know there are also 7 other I am statements? They're called the I am absolutes, technical term. It means I am without something after it. And so John 8:58 is the famous one. Before Abraham was born, I am. But there's a whole load of them. They're just slightly hidden by I am he in our English translation. John 4, John 6, John 8:24, John 8:28, John 8:58. There's one in John 13. There's the blitz of 3 when Jesus is arrested. That's another set of 7 I ams, but not the famous ones. But then you've also got 7 signs. Right, 7 signs, you heard of that in John's Gospel? I'm amazed at how many commentators get them wrong. Seems to me, if you're going to publish a commentary, please get it right. Okay, so what do you have, the 7 signs? The first sign by which Jesus showed himself to be the Messiah to his disciples, John 2, right? Turning the water into wine. And then as you go on through John's Gospel, there are references to signs. There is John 4, the healing of the official's son, at the end of John 4. Interestingly, Cana and Cana connected. Then you've got the healing of the man on the Sabbath in John 5. That's 3 signs. Then you've got the feeding of the 5,000 in John 6. That's sign 4. Then you've got the man born blind in John 9. That's sign 5. These are all referred to by the word sign in John. It's not like we're making it up. John's trying to get us to see it. And then after that, you've got the raising of Lazarus, which seems to be the climactic sign in John 11. That's only 6. People will put walking on the water as the 7th sign. It is a miracle. It's not called a sign. I think the reason the walking on the water is there is so that Jesus can give another I am statement. It's one of the 7 I am absolutes. I don't think it's the seventh sign. The seventh sign, in fact, I know this by looking at the text, the seventh sign that is mentioned in John's gospel is actually the resurrection of Jesus. But it's mentioned in John 2. You destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up again. Now, there were many people in Jerusalem who believed in Jesus because of the signs that he was doing. There's a sign reference in the context of Jesus talking about his resurrection, but we miss it, right? We're reading through and we go, yeah, water into wine, whoa, yeah, and we kind of go through and then we think, hang on, there's only 6. This is John's gospel, there must be a 7th. And so we go to the other miracle, which you could also go to the miraculous catch of fish in John 21. That's not a sign either. But it's neither of those, it's the resurrection. So it's building towards Lazarus, and Lazarus is like this big kind of highlight point to say, hey, look, everything's kind of coming together here. Look for this to happen even bigger. Not just a resuscitation, but an actual resurrection. They're technically different.
In Matthew 12, it says the sign of the prophet Jonah. So that really is a sign. It was reference to the resurrection in Matthew 12.
Right. Now, Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't seem to use the word sign in the same way that John does. So you're right. In those Gospels, they tend to kind of put all the emphasis on the sign of Jonah. Whereas in John, he takes the word sign and makes it a thing in reference to miracles. And instead of giving a blitz of miracles like the other 3 have, he's very selective. And he flags what he's doing as he goes. And it's just an interesting little detail. I honestly don't really hold commentators accountable for that. It doesn't matter, they've published on John, I haven't. But it is interesting that when you look closely at it, the word sign is connected to the resurrection of Jesus. What sign do you give us to show the authority by which you are cleansing the temple? Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it again. That's a sign. But it's almost like this dormant sign sitting in the background in our minds, like we've heard it, but it didn't register. And then we follow on through the book of John, through the book of signs, as it's called, the first half, because there's no mention of sign after John 11. But the final sign is at the end of John. It's just been referenced at the beginning. Does that make sense? That's a little bit of it'd be nice to lay that out on paper, but that wasn't our subject today. That was just bonus. I mean, you've paid so little anyway. You're getting free stuff on top of it. All right, so that's kind of the sign progression of John. And the reason I flagged that is because I really do think that John's deliberate in the way he writes. It's not that we're seeing things that aren't there. He is very deliberate about his 7s and about his I ams and his I am absolutes and his signs and so on. Any other comments, thoughts on where we've been so far? What's your impression? Yeah, okay, let's go here.
Since you're talking about John was a relative
Yep.
of the high priest, and he is observing all of this. He doesn't necessarily flee.
Right. Yeah, I missed that detail. I thought of it as I said it, but yeah, you're right.
And what do you think is he seeing all of this as you are presenting it happening? Or is he thinking this through?
It's hard to know, isn't it, what John's thinking. We know that John was a relative of the high priest, somehow connected. Even though he was a Galilean, Judas is the only southerner in the group, if Iscariot refers to where he's from. So all the other disciples are Galileans with their betraying accents, and yet John has this connection. How does Peter get into the courtyard? Through John. John's the guy, let him in. And so there's Peter in the courtyard, failing at the fireside. There's John letting him in, and the others have fled. So I honestly don't know. What is John's perspective on what's taking place? He's interesting with his details. He's obviously pondered it over the years. And so, for example, in John 18, as Peter is denying Jesus, I think it's 18 verse 22, but that's from memory, it mentions the charcoal fire. And there's like hey, your accent betrays you. You're a Galilean. Are you with him? No, I'm not. And then it seems like as he's drawing closer to the fire, the glow, the sort of orange glow of a charcoal fire, shows his face enough for him to be recognized, and then he sort of panics and denies more strongly. Once you get to John 21, as Peter gets onto the beach, when Jesus calls them and, he's cooked breakfast and they bring in the fish, Peter gets onto the beach and there's a charcoal fire. John gives us that same word in only those two places. In fact, nowhere else in the New Testament. But it's there to trigger our minds to go back exactly where Peter's mind was triggered to go back into the courtyard, back to the place where he denied Jesus. And so, I honestly don't know what John's thinking, but I know that John's thought a lot about it. And there's a lot of details going on there. It's interesting, when Jesus is on the cross, of course, John is the one that stood close. And so there does seem to be that connection. It's unfair on John to say they all fled and were gone. He seems to have stayed closer. At the same time, Jesus died for sinners, including John. So let's not, don't elevate him to the level of, Mary, the way she's elevated, who was also a sinner. Yeah, Ken.
How was John allowed into the temple with their proceedings? Just because he knew?
Some family connection, yeah.
But wouldn't he have been
Associated with Jesus.
Yeah, wouldn't they have made that connection?
I would think so. Yeah, it's intriguing. I mean, the fact that he's at the gate, when you've got a kind of a large infrastructure in place, if John was having a conversation with Caiaphas, then we'd have a total head-scratching situation. Like, what in the world? How is he talking to Caiaphas and not being arrested? But the fact that he's talking to the girl at the gate and getting somebody through the gate, it's kind of low level. It's the bouncer on the door is nowhere near as significant as the upper authorities.
I think it's in Luke where Jesus actually gets Peter's eye.
Yes.
In that courtroom scene. That must have been incredible.
That's right.
Jesus looks at him and he remembers,
Yeah.
that rooster just crowed. What did I do?
And the whole emphasis is on Peter. The fact that John gets him in is a detail that we seem to be given to help make sense of the fact that Peter's in there. Otherwise, we'd be saying, how did Peter get in there? But we know how he got in there, but then the whole focus is on Peter, and Luke does give us that little detail, potentially as Jesus is being moved either from Annas to Caiaphas or from Caiaphas to holding cell. Somewhere in there, he catches Peter's eye, and that's an incredibly powerful moment. So you're putting all these details together. One thing that's interesting about this is we're dealing with 4 documents. And we're dealing with 4 documents that have differences. Luke tells us about the trial before Herod. John tells us about the trial before Annas. The others don't mention those trials. We've got these differences. John doesn't tell us about the trial before Caiaphas, bizarrely. You ever thought about that? Why does he go from Annas to Pilate? That's like from trial 1 to trial 4. And trials 2 and 3, especially 2, are really important. Why does John skip all of that? I think it's because John feels he's already covered it. From chapter 5 onwards, he's made it very clear that the authorities are going to kill Jesus. They are determined to kill Jesus. And so why present again a narrative that's already been written in 3 Gospels? That's my sense with John. He knows the other 3. He's happy with the other 3. He's adding details that they didn't include. So he goes to Annas. They don't have that. He moves on to Pilate because he's already covered the nighttime trial. And so it's an interesting challenge for us to have these 4 documents and to try to put them together. That's called harmonizing them. Now, if you were going to go and do a PhD in the Gospels, please do, but don't do it just because of what I'm saying today. But if you were to go and do a PhD somewhere on the Gospels, one of your first jobs, your task, would be to create your own harmony of the whole thing. All 4 Gospels make them make sense. And some of it is complex. Does Jesus cleanse the temple at the beginning of his ministry or at the end of his ministry or both times? And, those kind of challenges. You've got the order of miracles in Matthew 8 and 9 that is slightly similar but slightly different than Mark and Luke. What do we do with that? The fascinating thing is when you come to the trials, you've got 4 accounts that include different trials, but they fit together almost perfectly. There's only one thing. I've been kind of working this through for the sake of a book, There's only one detail in here that I'm struggling and I'm not sure where to put it. After the break, I'll tell you what that detail is. All right, but right now it's 20 past. Oh, no, one more, and then we'll take a break.
Yeah. Was the Apostle Paul a member of this Sanhedrin?
No, I don't believe so. I think there's speculation he could have been. I suspect not. Gamaliel was his mentor. The interesting thing about Paul seems to be that he's a disciple of Gamaliel, and Gamaliel was known for being kind of a calming, diplomatic, keep the peace kind of a figure, kind of a senior figure of who would have kept this kind of brewing, simmering tension of Pharisees and Sadducees and all of that. Gamaliel was kind of like the sort of peacekeeper in that. Young Paul was a rising star in the ranks. He separates himself from Gamaliel to kind of make his own name soon after this. And so my understanding would be he would be on the outskirts of the connections here, but he's about to burst onto the scene, and he bursts onto the scene by going the exact opposite of his mentor. Gamaliel was not a drag people out of their homes and arrest them kind of a guy. Paul made his name by being that. And so I think Paul was connected. Maybe Gamaliel was involved. I'm not certain about that detail. But Paul was about to burst onto the scene. I've got no indication he was in that room.
Do you feel Paul would have seen Jesus at some time?
It's possible. It's possible that he may have had that opportunity because of Jews coming to Jerusalem for the feasts. Jesus coming for the feast, Jesus being known. Lots of rumors. Is he here? Is he coming? Where is he? If Paul Saul was in Tarsus, he wouldn't be required to come, but if he's a rising star in the Jewish ranks, or if he was training in Jerusalem at some point, there's a very good chance that he could have seen Jesus. We just don't know that. He certainly discovered who Jesus was when he met him, later, which fried his mind and made him rethink everything. But yes, interesting. These are some questions that we can kind of guess or surmise or make sense of to the best of our knowledge. But ultimately, we're going to get to heaven, and I always say, find the angel with glasses, the librarian angel, and say, I've got a question, just a little detail. If you can't get into the Paul seminar because he's really busy, go and find the angel, the librarian. All librarians always feel underutilized, so there must be, an angel there ready to answer some of these questions. But yeah, good questions. Let's take a break. If I say 15 minutes, is that okay? So restrooms, books, coffee, donuts, whatever is important to you. Chat, interact, 15 minutes, and then we'll carry on. Okay? Able to find your seat or another one you prefer? Just chatting with a couple of different people during the break, and one of those kind of reflections that keeps coming out, which is so on target, is Jesus' reference to my time has not yet come, my hour has not yet come. When you read John especially, he really brings that to the surface, because once you get to John 12, John 13, now is the Son of Man glorified. You know, that expectation of it's coming, it's coming, it's coming, suddenly it arrives. And so I think it's as Judas is kind of closing the door behind him, suddenly you get this little blitz of the word glory, and now is the Son of Man glorified, and glory, glory, glory for 2 or 3 verses. And then Jesus gives the great commandment to his disciples. It's like, it's going, it's happening, this is it. And the sense that you get all the way through is that there's no accident here. And even, we know that kind of whole gospel, right? Jesus set his face as a flint to go to Jerusalem, was that Luke 9. So there's a sense that he's going to the cross, and it's very deliberate. But what you get when you look at the trials closely is that in every trial, Jesus seems to be in charge. He's in charge with Annas. He gives them what they want in trial 2. He gives them what they want in trial 3. He's not kind of getting swept along or, like, oh, things are getting out of hand. This is exactly the plan of God being worked out. And the person who's most in charge through the whole thing is Jesus. I just find that incredibly faith-building. Not that I ever thought it was a mistake or an accident, but it's just good to see it in the detail. So what we're going to do now for the rest of our time is switch to the Roman trials, the morning 3. So we've had the kind of nighttime 3, Annas, Sanhedrin. Now we're going to go to Pilate. And there's a couple of Pilate trials with a Herod one in between. Let me just give you a little bit of detail about Pilate. Until 1961, the liberals would criticize evangelicals for believing in the Bible with such reasons as there's no evidence for Pilate. We never found any proof that Pilate even existed. He's such a central figure, there's no proof. Then in 1961, an Italian architect found a stone that had Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea, inscribed on it from a temple in Caesarea. You see the replica now. If you go to Israel, it's quite striking, and it's quite obvious. And so, of course, they had to rewrite all the criticisms of the Bible to exclude that, which has been kind of a non-stop exercise for the past 100 years, as archaeologists continue to find more and more evidence to support what we believe. And so it's fascinating to come from 1961, where that was discovered, to a few years back when Paul Maier wrote the book Pontius Pilate. Paul Maier is M-A-I-E-R, or something like that. He is a historian, I think, at the University of, which one is it, Wisconsin? Western Michigan, that sounds right. And Paul Maier is an expert in the history of the first century, kind of this era that we're looking at. And so he's written a couple of what we would call historical novels, but he wouldn't. Pontius Pilate and Flames of Rome. And he says these are not historical novels because every person that's named, I have evidence for. And when you read them, it's overwhelming how much evidence there is, because he footnotes it. And so you read this thing that's written like a historical novel. It's just gripping, quite disturbing in many places, but it's gripping. But then you look at the back in the endnotes, and he's telling you where he's getting it from Josephus and Dio Cassio and all these different kind of sources, Suetonius and so on. So he knows his sources, and he's able to piece it together and present it. And I would encourage you, if you want to understand the trial of Jesus, get Pontius Pilate by Paul Maier. Don't read it to your 9-year-olds. All right, it's quite disturbing. But read it for yourself, and I'm pretty sure you won't be able to put it down. It is gripping. And one of the things that comes through so strongly in that is that we actually know a load of information about Pilate from the written records, the historical records. So Pilate was a prefect, not a, what's the term we used to use? Well, governor kind of works both ways. Prefect rather than, there's another one beginning with P. Anyway, doesn't matter. So he was prefect in Judea from 26 to 36 AD. Just checking, it looked like 26 to 26. He lasted 11 years, which was the second longest of any of the governors, as we would call them, in that region in that first century. So just going back a little bit, Herod the Great, the one that tried to kill Jesus as a baby, was in charge of a huge region. When he died, he was replaced by Archelaus. We get a mention of him when Joseph and Mary are returning from Egypt. Their inclination, their first instinct is to settle in Bethlehem, which implies to me that they had connections there and probably weren't there for one night. But that's a Christmas issue that I look at in Pleased to Dwell. But their inclination is to settle in Bethlehem. But then they hear that Archelaus is in charge, and he's more of a nutcase than his father was, so they go back up to Galilee. That's just a quick passing reference to him. Archelaus was a disaster. So after him, the Romans split up the region. They didn't let a king kind of rule over the whole region on their behalf, as they had for 3 generations. And so they split the region, and Galilee in the north and Perea, the other side of the River Jordan, that was split off. That's like a quarter of the region, and it had a tetrarch over it. Tetrarch means you've got 1/4 or 1/4 of your dad's kingdom. So it's not a great title. It's like you're a disappointment kind of a title. So Herod Antipas, lots of them, were tetrarchs of Galilee. And then you've got another tetrarchy where Philip was, and then the ethnarchy, which is half the kingdom, wasn't given to a king, it was given to a governor brought in from the outside. We've got to control Jerusalem. Okay, so they brought in somebody from outside to rule it as governor or prefect. That's what Pilate was. Pilate was from the Ponti, which was sort of a tribe of Samnites, very kind of noble warriors that had been assimilated by the Romans and kind of brought down to a middle-class equestrian order, if that means anything to Roman historical buffs. But he was kind of Roman, but not fully Roman, but he was Roman. I mean, he was functionally quite significant. He would have been a soldier, a hardened soldier who'd served the kingdom or the empire. And he had connections, specifically a man named Sejanus, Sejanus. And Sejanus was incredibly significant in Rome. When Tiberius Caesar, the one who was Caesar at this time, was off in exile on the island of Capri because he had mental issues, we think, Sejanus kept things running. Okay, so if you can imagine having a president that is not all there mentally and being kind of kept off to one side, whoever's running the country is incredibly powerful at that point, right? I wasn't making any comment. What are you laughing at? So Sejanus was the guy who was super powerful in Rome, all right? And he was a friend of Pilate, and he had got Pilate this position of prefect of Judea. So Pilate had come into Judea, and his role there was what we already said: keep the peace, keep the tax income coming. All right, so that was his job. He lived out on the coast, probably a nice Italian-style mansion on the coast at Caesarea Maritima, and then every time there was a feast, 3 times a year, he would force himself to come into Jerusalem, and he'd travel in, and he'd get past the city wall and stay in the first building there, Herod's palace, and from there he would adjudicate and deal with and suppress and make sure that everything was calm and quiet, and as soon as he could, he'd get back out to the coast because he probably hated the Jews. Why? Because he'd messed up multiple times. And so let me just kind of give you a bit of background that is incredibly helpful to make sense of what was going on. Strike one: the Roman standards. Early on, as governor of this region, the Italian regiment, which is not just Roman soldiers, but Italian Roman soldiers, so this is like the special crowd with the best pizzas and, best accents and hand gestures, they came in to town overnight, and as they came into the Antonia fortress, they raised their standards. Flags or shields or, those kind of round things they used, emblems with the image of Caesar on it. They're proud, right? We're important. Here we are. As the sun rose in the morning, the Jews and the priests and everybody connected to the temple came into the temple courts, looked up at the Antonia fortress, and there was a graven image of a god in their view. They were so upset that they got a crowd of people marched out to Caesarea Maritima, where Pilate was, and they formed a protest, and they stayed there for 5 days, protesting, get that image off our temple. You've got a temple and you've got flags fluttering above it, not acceptable. And so Pilate's first instinct was, get rid of these crazy, pesky Jews, threaten them. And so the soldiers pulled their swords. What did the Jews do? They bared their necks. They said, we'll die before we give up what we're saying. This is too important. They knew how to fight for their freedom, right? In this case, they were ready to pay the ultimate price. And so the swords were put away, and it was a bit of an awkward situation. It's like a bad parenting standoff. You've got to win these battles. Pilate had backed away, and so the tension was set. That was strike one against him. Strike two, he decided to do something for the good of Jerusalem. They were lacking water, so he created an aqueduct, bringing water in from near Bethlehem, so several miles away. This water was transported in to serve the temple and the city. That should get people on side, except some investigative journalists looked into it and found out that he'd got the money from the temple treasury. How dare he use temple money for his building project? And so they all got upset, and they confronted him, and they were there protesting again. He was like, what am I supposed to do with these people? This time he told his soldiers to, on a certain command, mix in with the crowd, undercover, plain clothes, and on the right command, you pull out some clubs and start hitting people. That will disperse the crowd. Unfortunately, some soldiers got carried away, pulled out swords, and shed some blood. And so you can imagine it didn't die down. There was a massive outcry against him. Strike two. Then strike three. Because of the spilling of blood, see if I can get the laser off, there we go. Because of the spilling of blood that took place, there was massive complaints, including from Herod Antipas, the next door neighbor tetrarch, who sent a complaint to Rome to say, this guy's out of control here. He's going to blow up. You've got to do something. This is a political disaster. Okay, so there's tensions between Pilate and Herod, historically. Strike three, Pilate decides he needs to do something to try and get the emperor on side, and so he decides the best way to do that is to display some golden shields, not with images, because he'd learned his lesson from strike one, but with some wording. Like, isn't Caesar awesome? Let's just say he wrote that. Okay, that'll do. Americanized paraphrase, Caesar is awesome. And he put these shields, not publicly, but privately in Herod's palace within Jerusalem. Either Herod's palace or the Hasmonean palace. I think it was Herod's palace, the place where he would be, where no Jew would cross the threshold. Problem was, somebody crossed the threshold, a cleaner or a cook or somebody's cousin, saw it, reported it, the word spread, and the word got back to the emperor. And so Tiberius sent a letter to Pilate saying, get those shields out of Jerusalem, you fool. Put them in a temple on the coast. And so he's really in trouble. His neighboring king has complained to the emperor. He's received a letter from the emperor telling him that he needs to change what he's doing. He knows that he's in trouble. I mean, this is already 3 strikes. It's pre-baseball, so he's going to last a little bit longer, but he knows he's almost out. And can you imagine how much he was frustrated with the Jews? No matter what he did, they just seemed to make his situation worse. All of that had happened in the 7 years between arriving in Judea and now the morning of possibly, there's questions over dates, but the morning possibly of Friday, April 3rd, 33 AD. Whatever, I'm not worried about the date, but it's roughly 7 years since he arrived. He's had all these strikes against him. He's got incredible frustration with the Jews. He's almost trying to survive, because if he blows it, it's not like a demotion. One detail I forgot to mention was, in terms of the shields, he'd also received word that Sejanus had fallen out of favor in Rome. So the guy that had got him the job in the first place, the guy that he was connected with, had been found guilty of treason, had been strangled, and his body thrown into the Tiber River, which was politically kind of normal, but a disaster if that's your guy. Oh, Pilate, friend of Sejanus. No, never knew Sejanus. Right? It's awkward. That was also in the background. So everything about this is setting Pilate up for a really tense situation, which then brings us into the Pilate trials. Okay, so let's kind of work our way through these. It's fascinating when you kind of look at this, that there's so much detail. This is a really extended conversation. We're not going to work our way through every question and answer, although maybe we should. But I do want you to know where we are geographically. So they've gone from the house of Caiaphas probably into the temple for the morning trial. Now they're coming over here to Herod's palace. It's confusing because Herod isn't in Herod's palace, but Pilate is. This was his standard location, right on the edge of the city. You see where that is? There's, right next to the road. You can imagine him coming from the coast, I forget which road it is, but getting through the gate and then quickly ducking into this place. He just did not like Jerusalem, because it seemed like every time he interacted with Jews, he made his own situation worse. So he would have been in his palace, or in Herod's palace, as it was known, in that part of the city, probably arrived maybe a few days before. It's interesting in Paul Meyer's depiction of events, he's got Jesus arriving on Palm Sunday, or the 10th day of the month, arriving from the other side, over here, coming up from Bethany and up the Kidron Valley, and all the Galilean Jews celebrating his arrival. Now, Jesus was never that popular in Galilee, but once you put Jesus in Jerusalem and you get crowds of Galileans, they start getting a little bit, he's one of us, isn't he? And so they start celebrating that the famous person is Jesus of Nazareth. Yes, that's us. And so they're responding positively to Jesus. And so you've got Jesus coming in on the donkey, and at the same time, on the other side of town, Pilate arriving to make sure there's no trouble. It's quite a poignant moment. And Paul Meyer seems to think that could very well have been the timing, literally arriving together. I'm not sure how he's so certain, but he does seem to know his stuff. So Pilate's there, and it's Friday morning, the feast is here, and they come with Jesus. When they bring Jesus to him, it's kind of this bizarre moment at the start of it. In John's explanation, at least, Pilate starts with a question that seems to be a surprise. What accusation do you bring against this man? And the reason I think that's a surprise is because of their response. If this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you. I think they thought Pilate was just going to rubber stamp whatever they said. They've already got him in trouble, over a barrel, whatever. He is in a difficult spot. They've got power over him. They know all they've got to do is to start becoming a bit of a crowd, and Pilate's going to be panicking about his future. And so I suspect that the Jewish leaders thought, once we've got Jesus and we know that he's the troublemaker, we've already decided that for over a year, once we bring him to Pilate, Pilate will kill him just to keep the calm. And instead, Pilate, perhaps out of frustration, treats it like a real legal hearing. He says, okay, so what's the accusation? I'm the judge. I have authority. You don't make decisions. I do. So what's the accusation? And their response is, well, he's obviously guilty because he's here, isn't he? Imagine that in your court system. What's the charge? Well, he's guilty, isn't he? And maybe you've seen that. When there's a trial and it's already decided that the person's guilty, it becomes a bit of a sham. Right? It becomes a crazy situation. They decided Jesus was guilty, and they expected Pilate to toe the line. And they had good reason to think that he would, based on past experience, the 3 strikes. But Pilate, from his side, is so frustrated with the Jews, and probably frustrated with being pushed around by them, that he's going to exert his authority. Remember how he does this at the other end of the event as well? When he puts the inscription over the cross, and they come to him and say, no, put he said. And he's like, I'll do what I want. Go away. I wrote what I wrote. I'm in charge. He is the governor. Even if he's a slightly panicked governor, he still has all the power. And so at the beginning of the trial and at the end of the thing, he's reasserting his power. But in between, maybe a slightly different story. So notice their accusation. We found this man speaking blasphemy and making himself equal with God? No, that would be pointless with a Roman authority. We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king. You see the charge they're bringing now. It's very Roman. It's like they're putting on an Italian accent to make sure that Pilate gets the significance. So what's the issue here? Misleading our nation. Who's leading this nation? Shouldn't be a Jew. Forbidding us to give tribute to Caesar. Alarm bells. That's my main job, is to make sure money does go to Caesar. And this guy is forbidding that. And he's saying that he's a king. Well, there's no king but Caesar. So they've put it in Roman terms for Pilate's sake. Yeah, we tracking with that? It's very manipulative. These were not the things they were talking to Jesus about the night before. You know, they didn't care whether Jesus said give money to Rome or not. They didn't want to give money to Rome either. They would have agreed with him if he'd have said that. But now, for Pilate's sake, they're pushing it. Any thoughts or comments about this kind of setup, this situation? Let's just go to John 18 for a second.
Deliberately lying, because he never did forbid them. He gave that great answer, render to Caesar and so forth.
Yeah. Hard to imagine them lying about it, isn't it? It really is fascinating to watch a miscarriage of justice like this, and to just realize that the power of power. You know, this isn't about did Jesus break the Jewish law and did Jesus break the Roman law? This was about railroading the system to get what they wanted. And if the system was in the way, they would push it aside. And that's happened so many times through history on so many issues. And yet people always seem to assume the best about humans. Well, there must be a legal reason for that. It must be possible to do that. We're seeing that all over the place, where the law is just set aside because there's an agenda that is being driven. So let me just read to you John's account of this first part of the trial. From John 18, verse 28, then they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early morning. Doesn't mean that they hadn't been to the temple or that they didn't go via the temple to do it, but where he stayed overnight was the house of Caiaphas. Where he went to was the governor's headquarters, Herod's palace, and it was still early morning, maybe 6:30, something like that. They themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. You don't want to tread onto Gentile territory. That would mess their day up, and they've got work to do. So Pilate went outside to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered with their blustering response, well, if he wasn't doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you. Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." The Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death." This was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken to show by what kind of death he was going to die. If they put Jesus to death, he would have died by stoning. But how was he going to be killed? According to Jesus' words, when the Son of Man is lifted up. John 3, John 8, John 12. So that lifted up. And if you miss it in John 3 and John 8, by the time you get to John 12, John makes it clear Jesus said this to show by what kind of death he was going to die. He was not talking about lifted up in ascension or lifted up to heaven. No, he was going to be lifted up on a cross. It was a euphemism, a way of referring to the cross without uttering the words. So Pilate entered his headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" If you can imagine the scene, Pilate is going outside to inside. There's a back and forth. Outside are these Jews who will not cross the threshold. Inside now is Jesus, who's a prisoner who goes where he's pushed. And Pilate goes back and forth between a conversation with the Jews and a conversation with Jesus. Do you remember The Passion of the Christ, the movie? Don't know if maybe some of you saw that. It was striking in many ways. One of the things about it was that it was all in Aramaic. So you had to read the subtitles, which was kind of weird for a few minutes, but you got used to it. But it's one of my absolute highlights of, I don't know if I'm allowed to say that. Can you have a highlight of The Passion of the Christ? Because it's such a horrific film. But one of the highlights for me where I just went, yes, was when Pilate comes into Jesus and addresses him in Latin, which is almost certainly not what would have happened. But let's go along with their version of it. He addresses Jesus in Latin, and Jesus responds in Latin. You probably wouldn't notice if you're just reading the subtitles, but if you recognize either Hebrew, which is like Aramaic, or Italian, which is like Latin, you can spot the difference. And I just loved that. In that moment, I was sat there in the theater with a whole bunch of guys from our church out in Oregon, and inside I just went, yes, my Jesus can speak Latin. You know, like, why not? If Pilate wants to talk Latin, he can talk. If he had a conversation in Greek, I'm sure Jesus could have handled that too, because Jesus is cool. Not a massive deal, but... So, where are we? So he says to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?" What do you think Pilate was used to when he spoke to a criminal? By the time a criminal gets to Pilate, this is not a traffic offense. Normally, criminals come to Pilate who are about to be executed. And so I'm sure Pilate was very used to criminals cowering, blubbering, panicking, begging, just doing anything they possibly can to deny and try to get out of the situation they're in. That would have been every day for him. And now he's face to face with someone who's asking him questions in a calm manner. Do you say this of your own accord, or did someone else say this about me? Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews, but my kingdom is not from the world." Then Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I'm a king," as in, absolutely yes. "For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" Just think about politics in his era. Actually, politics in any era. One thing that happens with people that are involved in politics is that they get very jaded. Everybody is speaking truth with money and influence and lobbying and everything else and agendas. And after a while, you probably start to panic and think there's no truth to be found, right? No matter who it is that takes the microphone, I can't hear truth anymore because my head is spinning. That's the way politics messes with people. And so for Pilate to say what is truth, I think is a really poignant comment. He's getting beaten from every side. He's in trouble. He's kind of fighting for his own life in some ways, politically. And so he asks Jesus, "What is truth?" And then sadly, he walks away. If only he'd stayed for an answer. We can speculate what Jesus might have said, about the answer to that question, but honestly, we don't know, because after he had said this, he went back outside to the Jews and told them, I find no guilt in him. That's quite a statement. He's just had this interaction with someone who's spoken to him differently than anyone he's ever probably spoken to before in this position, and his conclusion is, may not know what's going on, but I know he's not guilty. He's in a different category than everyone else that stands before me. There's something different about this guy. He is not guilty. After he had said this, he went back outside, read that, verse 39, but you have a custom. Now, I think this is the moment where John is combining two trials. Because Luke tells us that Jesus goes away. So in Luke's gospel, we get the Herod Antipas trial. Okay, and let me see, let's just go to it. It's probably the easiest way. Luke 23. Luke 23. Let's go to verse 4. Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, I find no guilt in this man. We just saw that in John. But they were urgent, saying, he stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea from Galilee even to this place. He's a troublemaker. You've got to stop him. You've got to do this. So they're starting to panic a little bit. And in their panic, they start saying, no, he's trouble everywhere. And in doing so, they mention Galilee. And Pilate sees an opportunity. Verse 6, when Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him over to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time. Okay, so if we look at the map, from the breakfast meeting over here in Herod's palace, Jesus is sent to the Hasmonean palace here. Not very far, take a few minutes to get there. That's where Herod was. In from out of town, lots of Galileans in the area. Maybe it's politically beneficial for him to be there in case they start to create trouble, whatever. Herod's in town. Pilate sees an opportunity. What's he thinking? If you were Pilate, why would you want to send him to Herod? Any thoughts?
Let someone else take the blame.
Yeah, I can't deal with this situation. If someone else deals with it, I'm absolved. Anything else?
Some leverage, maybe make some points.
Yeah. I mean, Herod's already complained to Caesar about Pilate, so actually, as much as he probably despises Herod, it's not a bad idea to offer him a gift. You know, a box of chocolates ain't going to cut it. Let's offer him Jesus.
Do you think he was maybe a little afraid of Jesus?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I think what you find with Pilate is that there's a religiousness and a superstitiousness about him, and the whole situation seems to be panicking him slightly. Plus, we know from Matthew that his wife sends the report that she's had a dream and he should have nothing to do with this man, which would have panicked a Roman. Very superstitious people in that era. Mustn't upset the gods or whatever. You know, there's no sense that he's thinking, oh, maybe this is the Messiah, maybe this is, the Son of God. He's not thinking in Christian terms. He's thinking in superstitious terms, and he's thinking in political terms. I'm in trouble. Herod, that'll do. Send him to Herod. Herod probably was used to Pilate sort of playing the big guy. I'm the prefect of the larger region. You're just a tetrarch of an insignificant region. That would have been the tone of their relationship before. But Herod has got Caesar on Pilate's back, and so Pilate now is saying, well, no, you are important. It does, your role does matter, and I want to honor you. Here's a gift. And so that's kind of political, right? That's what's going on. So Herod, yeah.
Can I just ask a question in regards to the policy of Rome?
Yeah.
From what I understand, I'm not an expert on this, but wasn't it their practice or their policy not to intervene in the affairs of the
As much as possible, yeah.
I'm sorry.
As much as they could.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, was this unusual that Pilate would take it upon himself, or they would come to Pilate when they know they probably wouldn't get any help, because really they were allowed to practice their religion, do the
Yeah.
things that they were doing before.
Yeah, the Jews were allowed to be Jewish as long as they played by Roman rules. And the Roman rules were don't riot and pay your taxes. And so I think in every region, the Romans would allow people to kind of carry on life because that's how you generate money. Lockdowns do not aid business, so they would kind of try to keep things going, but they had to keep things controlled. There couldn't be any uprisings or any issues. And so of all the different regions of the empire, this was the troublesome one. These were the hardest people to rule.
But that's what I was referring to. I mean, Pilate's concern, Rome's concern was not to disturb the local people in the areas that they govern.
Right.
But to keep things calm because they don't want to keep putting out fires,
Exactly.
They wanted to let them rule
Yeah,
a hand still upon them.
that's right. And so the issue in Judea, or Palestine as people would call it, is it's just really difficult to rule. You've got to be more hands-on and yet strangely hands-off. And so in another region, you could say, okay, here are the Roman gods, put them in your temple and we'll leave you alone, you get on with things. And they'd say, okay, fine, yeah, we'll add some gods, carry on. Get into this region, they wouldn't accept the Roman gods. They wouldn't work on Sabbaths. They had all these kind of quirky rules that they were willing to die for. And so from a Roman perspective, this is kind of the poison chalice. You don't get to be governor of Judea as your sort of practice. You practice somewhere easy. This is a trickier one, a more difficult place. But it's also kind of the back end of the empire. So it's not prestigious. It's not high profile in one sense. It's just a really nasty place to have to be. And so for Pilate to be there for 11 years was huge. Most people lasted 3, 4, 5, and then they moved on, promoted to something nicer. And so there's a kind of a weird dynamic between the Jews and the Romans, but the Romans couldn't allow the Jews to just be indiscriminately killing their prisoners, because what would happen if the Judeans killed a Galilean? The Galileans would get upset. And so to keep calm, this level of kind of high-level legal jurisprudence, it's better to leave that in our hands. And that's why they're coming to Pilate, because he's the one with the authority. Yeah.
But at the heart of this whole issue is a theological question, isn't it? Who is God? Is Caesar to be God, or here's another one claiming to be God? So which one?
Yeah, there is a theological issue, but the claim of Caesar to be God was very early at this stage. It really developed a lot more a few years later. Certainly by the time you get past Nero, who was seriously gone in the head. That it's later on, even into the next century, before you start to get stronger emphasis on, Caesar equals God. I think at this stage, more likely to get the ear of Pilate by saying this guy claims to be king. Because there's one king. The king is Caesar. And we think King Herod, king this, king that. Those were puppets. Those were little people serving King Caesar. He was the king of kings. Is that kind of their view of it? And so you're absolutely right. This is a theological issue. I'm not sure they would have seen it quite in theological terms from the Roman side yet. They would have seen it much more from a political and financial perspective. This man's claiming to be king and he's stopping people from giving money to Caesar. Got to deal with this. So that's the stronger emphasis. But there is already that sense of almost divine worship of Caesar, hence the issue with the standards fluttering. They were able to call it an inscription of a god. But there's some debate about when that Caesar worship really became fully flourished.
You're saying it's later on that
Yeah.
the Christians were put to death because they wouldn't
I think so, yeah, 60s, 50s, 60s. So not hundreds of years, but a couple of decades later. At this stage, certainly in the Pilate exchange, it seems to be primarily political. But that's there. Those things don't emerge in a heartbeat. Those things kind of build up. So there's already that sense of Caesar's so powerful, and the Romans worship him. You know, that kind of language probably would have been fairly common. Yeah.
I'm puzzled why Herod would have been pleased to see Jesus. He seen Jesus as a problem.
Well, it seems like he'd never met Jesus. It seems like he'd heard rumors, and so he was probably stuck in his palace most of the time. Certainly, John the Baptist had got his attention, and he spent quite a bit of time with John the Baptist, right? When John the Baptist was arrested, and we're kind of told that there was this kind of ongoing thing, and he was almost kind of, yeah, I like this guy, and then, you know, the whole birthday party incident, and John the Baptist lost his head. So Herod has been in the region where Jesus has been, but I don't get the sense that Herod has been at every miracle we've read about. And so he's heard the rumors, he's heard the gossip, he's heard the people getting excited about it. He wants to see it. And often the way that this scene is depicted in movies is quite a contrast. With Pilate, you have this very kind of stoic Roman, you know, kind of straight character. Herod is often portrayed as having this really lavish breakfast with semi-dressed women and, you know, grapes being dropped in his mouth and big fans and leopards lying around and stuff like that. I think it's a fascinating portrayal, and there is a little bit of historical evidence to say that's the kind of king he was. And so you can sort of picture the scene with Herod there, and now Jesus gets brought in from Pilate, of all people. This is turning into a good breakfast for Herod. He's expecting to see some. Give him a pack of cards. Come on, let's see something. He wants to see some magic.
Do you think perhaps that he wanted Herod to kill him, so he wouldn't have to get involved? He could wash his hands, so to speak, and let Herod do the
Yes,
dirty work?
yes, absolutely. I think that's what Pilate would have expected of Herod. Is Herod, I'm going to honor Herod in a token way. Herod's going to probably just deal with the problem for me and, you know, make himself popular and think he's got one over on me, and I don't care because it's a problem off my hands. It seems like the perfect solution, I suspect. So it wouldn't surprise me at all if Pilate's expecting Herod to do the deed. Or at the very least to arrest him and take him back to Galilee. Either way, he's off my hands. Okay, so let's read what happened. Get the right column. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had long desired to see him, because he had heard about him, and he was hoping to see some sign done by him. So he questioned him at some length, but Jesus made no answer. The chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. That's interesting. When Jesus was sent from Pilate to Herod, the chief priests and the Jewish authorities went with him. They didn't say, oh, good. They probably didn't trust Herod one bit. And so they're there to apply pressure. So as Herod's saying, Jesus, I've got a pet leopard that isn't walking right. No response? Okay, Jesus, I hear you multiply food. What can you do with these steaks? No response. Okay, Jesus. I mean, you can imagine Herod trying to goad Jesus into doing something. Jesus says absolutely nothing, which I think is awesome, because Herod's an idiot. Honestly, I love the fact that Jesus has a conversation with Pilate, something Pilate would have never had before. Probably a sensible conversation at that moment. With Herod, he's just a buffoon. And so Jesus totally blanks him because he's not the issue. He's not the one that's going to finish this story. And so can we just get this over and done with? And meanwhile, the authorities are there saying, yeah, and he's done this, and he's done this, and he's done this. And they're suddenly cheering Herod on, trying to get Herod to get upset with Jesus. Martin.
Inside the palace here?
Yeah.
Couldn't go inside the palace.
The Hasmonean palace was not defiled by Gentiles. Technically, Herod's a king of Galilee. Technically, Herod Antipas is Jewish. And so they were either on the threshold or were not told that they stayed outside. So I think they could have been inside barracking at this point. Yeah. Okay, verse 11. And Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then, arraying him in splendid clothing, he sent him back to Pilate. So he doesn't get anything from Jesus. And so he does what authorities do, and that is to lash out, and there's a beating and a dressing in expensive clothing. It's possible, and this is total conjecture, don't get carried away with this, but if in the Hasmonean palace Herod said, let's put a royal robe on him, if he's going to be king, and I can't get him to do a miracle, let's have some fun at his expense, put a royal robe on him, some have speculated that they could have gone to the closet, pulled out a royal robe that was stored there. It could have been Herod the Great's robe. Now, we'll never know till heaven, and I certainly wouldn't take the slightest criticism for that view. I'm just saying it's not impossible, is it? But if it were, wouldn't that be fascinating that Jesus, who Herod the Great tried to kill, is now being mocked in Herod the Great's robe? I don't know, it makes for a good novel. But we'll have to check the sources. And Herod and Pilate, we're told in verse 12, became friends with each other that very day, for before this they had been at enmity with each other. So Herod so appreciated the gesture that there was a connection formed.
Could it be that Jesus was fulfilling prophecy by not answering the questions, whereas he did
Yes,
answer questions with
of course, yeah.
And that drove him into a sense of being really mad at Jesus
Yep.
for not answering. So now he's going to punish him. He's not going to kill him, but he's offended.
Yes.
He sends him back.
That's exactly right. He's upset, he's offended, he's not getting the miracle show he wanted. Okay, guards, give him a beating. You know, it's hard for us, even with Hollywood the way it is. We don't experience that kind of level of physical violence in our own lived experience. It's hard for us to realize how easy it was in that world for there to be physical violence. He's been struck before Annas. He's been mocked and ridiculed and beaten in the Sanhedrin, trial 2. Trial 3 was quick. I don't think there's anything physical there. Probably pretty rough handling. Trial 4 before Pilate, conversation with Pilate, but now trial 5, there's physical violence again. This is happening repeatedly, and it's normal. Authorities do not tend to view subjects as worth caring for. It's a very unusual system that treats humans as having equal value.
If the plan had failed and Herod would have killed him, Jesus would not have gone to the cross.
Exactly, yeah.
Jesus had to make sure that it didn't end there. He had to go back to Pilate.
Yep. There's a whole lot of that going on, that Jesus is making sure that his death is the right death. Yep.
There's a whole lot of significance that I have never been upon the depths of. The robes on, the robes off, the beating, take his clothes off, beat him, put his robes back on him. And it was specifically told that through the Gospels. And I've never really been able to plumb the depths of what that really is about. There's got to be something in that.
I'm not going to make a great spiritual insight, but just in terms of the history of it, the robe that was put on him here is probably white, probably ornate, and highly valuable. When we read about him getting dressed in a scarlet robe or a crimson robe by the soldiers, and the crown of thorns put on his head, that's the Roman soldiers doing that. And that's a different robe.
Yeah, but it's not his robe.
It's not his robe. His robe, probably this robe, is taken off him. He's then beaten and mocked in the other robe whenever that beating occurs. And that, by the way, is the only thing that doesn't just fall into place when you look at the 4 Gospels. Is he beaten early by Pilate, or is he beaten on the way to crucifixion, or is it both? That's the only thing that doesn't harmonize easily in this. Well, I think his robe is probably this robe that is royal robes from the Hasmonean palace, which makes sense then when he's redressed in his robe, taken to the cross, and the soldiers don't split it, because they're looking at a thing that's worth something. And so they cast lots for it. If this was just a throw-on kind of a poncho, All right, you have that bit, I'll have that bit, who cares? But this is like, whoa, that's valuable. Let's cast lots, because ripping this thing up is not going to do us any good. And that's my understanding of it. Now, whether it's Herod the Great's robe is really a speculative leap. It's possible, very unlikely. But that this is a rich, ornamented robe is implied in the language.
See, I thought that was his personal robe that take off the robe for his son.
I don't think so, but we'll see. Okay, so the Herod affair with all the leopards and jugglers and whatever way you want to portray that finishes. Jesus is then sent back to Pilate, and we get trial number 6. Okay, so this is Pilate part 2. So we can go back to John, and this trial continues. John chapter, where are we? 18:38. So at the end of 38, I find no guilt in him. Luke uses that phrase. He's sent off to Herod. He comes back. And it carries on in John as if there's no break, because he's not given us the Herod part. So he introduces the next thought. But you have a custom that I should release one man for you at the Passover. So do you want me to release to you the King of the Jews? Now, that's always struck me as being a slightly strange question. They obviously don't want him to release Jesus, right? But Pilate is now declaring him innocent and just kind of wanting to release him. Legally, that's what he needs to do. Maybe his hope is that the clock's ticking. He's been to Herod. He looks like he's taken a bit more of a beating. There's more blood, more bruising. Maybe that's enough now. They've had their moment. They've presented their man. Now, I can give them a way out of this so that they can say, yeah, okay, good enough. Thanks so much, Pilate. Have a good day. I'll do the custom of releasing the prisoner. And so I think that's kind of what's going on here, is there's this kind of attempt from Pilate to get Jesus released. And so if you look down on the notes there, there's a crowd that's going to be mentioned in the text that are pressuring him. We'll talk about that in just a second. There's Procula, that's Pilate's wife, historical name apparently. Her dream that Matthew tells us about, pressuring him. But then if you see on the notes there, Pilate's plan. He seems to have a plan to try and get Jesus released. And part one of that plan is to just offer to release him, offer the prisoner release in exchange for Barabbas. There's a sort of an irony, isn't there, that Barabbas' name, Bar, son of Abba, son of a father. Probably a name, who knows, maybe his dad was a notorious criminal too. He's like, well, he's a son of his dad, isn't he? And so the name son of his dad kind of stuck, and Barabbas was this notorious, nasty guy that was imprisoned, and he's offered. Pilate isn't expecting them to go for Barabbas. He's expecting them to accept that what they've wanted, the attention, the negative attention, the shaming, the beating, all of that stuff with Jesus, that's satisfied now. And he's not just facing the same group of accusers. He's now facing a crowd. There may have been a crowd at the earlier part of the trial, at 6:30 in the morning, but it might have been that when he went off to Herod's palace, the crowd started to form. I'm not sure on when the crowd comes, but there is a crowd in front of Pilate. And from Pilate's perspective, it's kind of hard to see the Hasmonean palace. The Herod's palace is this structure up here. Here's a picture of a model of it. It's kind of like two palaces with this courtyard in between. And the courtyard is not massive. If you put 200 or 300 people in that courtyard, it feels overwhelmed. And so Pilate in Herod's palace is on his doorstep with these accusers of Jesus and all of Jerusalem, or a couple of hundred people. And we've heard so many times over the years that the crowd that's chanted Blessed be the King who comes in the name of the Lord. On Palm Sunday, we're crying, crucify him on Good Friday. That's almost certainly not true. When Jesus arrived, he was arriving to a Galilean crowd who were celebrating one of their own. He was popular with them, especially when they were out of town and saw him. There was this popular uprising that he's the one that feeds us, he's the one that does miracles, and best of all, he's from Nazareth, so he's one of us. So the Galileans would have welcomed Jesus into Jerusalem, and John makes that clear. The crowd that had gone up to the feast were the ones chanting that. And then there was the crowd coming out from the city, and mixing in with them was the crowd from Bethany that saw Lazarus raised and witnessing about it. And so you've got some distinct crowds on the Sunday. Who do you get on Friday morning in Herod's palace? Probably not the Galileans. They'd be right on the other side of the city, camping, or staying in Bethany, or staying somewhere else. We're talking 6:30, 7:30 in the morning. They were just kind of trying to find their cereal for breakfast. They weren't on this side of town. But what the authorities had plenty of time to do was rouse temple workers who lived close by on this side of town and say, get into the Hasmonean Palace courtyard before you start your duties. The first part of your job today is to get in there and shout when we shout. What are we shouting about? Don't worry about it. We'll tell you when you get there. And so it's rent a crowd or employ a crowd. These are workers brought in so that Pilate, as an ignorant Roman from out of town, looks and panics. We know that he's susceptible to crowds. And so here's a crowd, a couple of hundred people, and he's going to be panicking. He's going to be thinking, this is it. If I don't do what they ask, they're going to complain to Caesar. You can see how it's all set up, right? But Pilate has got this sense of duty in his role that he needs to do the right thing. And so what does he do? Let's jump back to this. Plan 1, offer prisoner release. They said, no, we want Barabbas. So 19 verse 1, part 2 of the plan, flog Jesus. Pilate took Jesus and flogged him. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head and arrayed him in a purple robe. They came up to him saying, Hail, King of the Jews, and struck him with their hands. Pilate went out again. Remember that back and forth. He keeps going from Jesus to the crowd. He went out again and he said to them, See, I am bringing him out to you that you may know that I find no guilt in him. So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, Behold the man. The significance of that phrase there is probably mocking. The man you're so worked up about has taken such a beating, he doesn't look like a man. He can barely stand up, dripping in blood. I mean, the experience and the skill of Roman soldiers at beating a prisoner was absolutely extraordinary. My other highlight, again, if that's the right word, from the Passion of the Christ, comes when Jesus is being flogged. It's an awful scene. But one of the soldiers makes a comment in Latin. Su resistencia es incredibile. His resistance is incredible. I just love that. Like, yes, that's my Jesus. Lots of people died in the floggings. This wasn't just a little slapping around. This was shredding the flesh. And Jesus survived the flogging. But Pilate brings him out to the crowd, and I think his intent here is for them to say, okay, that's enough. That'll do. Let's not worry about the other stuff. We've got work to do. Time is pushing on. You know, it's a feast day. Okay, he's never going to look the same again. He's scarred for life. Let's just leave it at that. That'll do. He's no king. Doesn't work. By the way, one quick comment about Roman soldiers. They're very rarely Italian. The Italian regiment was the Italian regiment, but it was special because most regiments were not Italians. What were most regiments made up of? Local conscripts. People who would work as soldiers in order to earn the retirement plan of a Roman soldier. And so where would they get Roman soldiers from in Judea? Not Jews. They wouldn't join. They'd get Samaritans. And to me, that just adds another dimension. If Jesus is being beaten and flogged by Roman soldiers who are Samaritan, you can just imagine the increased tension in that moment. We get to beat a Jewish Messiah figure. Let's go for it. And so you see every little detail, even little historical details, just ramp up the amazement of our hearts at what Jesus has done for us. And so it carries on. When the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, "Crucify him, crucify him," agitating the crowds, getting the cry. They're determined. Pilate is pushing back. And so part 3 is almost bizarre here. Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." Now, that's a pretty weird statement. He knows he can't do that. But he's desperate now. He's tried offering a prisoner release. He's tried flogging him half to death. Now he's just trying to hand him over and just kind of be dealt with the whole situation. The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and according to that law he ought to die because he has made himself the Son of God." So now they've gone religious for the first time. When Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. He was already afraid politically. Now he's afraid superstitiously. You don't go around claiming to be the Son of God around Romans and not expect them to react. His reaction would not be, "Oh, that's a Jewish thing." His reaction would be, "Uh-oh. Hang on, what does that mean?" He's got a very different view of what God is, or what the gods are, but fear is the response. And so Pilate heard this. He was even more afraid. He entered his headquarters again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. This is different than the first time round where they had a conversation. So Pilate said to him, "You will not speak to me? Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you?" Jesus answered him, "You would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given to you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin." Part 4 of Pilate's plan comes in verse 12. From then on, Pilate sought to release him. What does that mean? I think at that point, Pilate is inside with Jesus. He's talking to Jesus. He's not getting a response. He's gone, "Are you kidding me? You're not going to speak to me? Don't you know how much power I have?" And he's panicking. And Jesus says, "You wouldn't have power unless it was given to you." Jesus is still completely in control, completely calm. And then Pilate sought to release him. The crowd's out there. I honestly think Pilate is looking at the options. Is there a back door we can get him out of? Because I'm scared of this person. They're calling him the Son of God. My wife's having dreams. I'm superstitious. I'm in trouble with them. What am I supposed to do? He's looking for a way to kind of say, "Look, just come out here, get on that horse and run as fast as you can." He's looking for plan Z, whatever, like Z as you would say. He's planning for some way out for Jesus. But notice what happens in verse 12. The Jews cried out. So you've got this crowd outside, and their voices are coming in. And what are they saying? "If you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar." So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, in Aramaic, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour, that's 9 a.m. He said to the Jews, "Behold your king." They cried out, away with him, crucify him." Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." So he delivered him over to them to be crucified. Notice that entire paragraph from verse 12 to verse 16 is manipulative. The Jews didn't view Caesar as their king. But what they knew was that Pilate was in trouble with Caesar. In fact, Pilate, having been connected with Sejanus, the guy we mentioned earlier in Rome, probably had on his hand one of those rings that said Amici Caesare on there, Cesare, however you pronounce your Latin, friend of Caesar. It was like a special club that the the guys, sort of like a members-only deal. Pilate would have had that. Friend of Caesar on a ring. And out of the crowd's mouth is coming this thing that is so big, the whole of Jerusalem saying it, essentially, if you don't crucify him, you're losing not just that ring. What's happened to your friend Sejanus is going to happen to you. You're going to be thrown into the river. You're going to be finished. Forget your career. Your life is over. They're manipulating. They've got him in a corner and they're pushing, and he knows he's lost. He's been humiliated by the Jews, and he hands Jesus over. Now, I do not want to give the impression that Pilate was innocent. Because in that moment, like in so many moments for humans, it kind of boils down to, will we trust God or will we trust self? Will we do what God wants or will we protect our own life? And in that moment, Pilate chooses self. He doesn't choose Jesus. He knows Jesus is innocent. He has a feeling that Jesus is more than normal human. He knows the truth. But he's going to protect his own neck. And so he hands Jesus over and goes against his own conscience, but sins in doing so. So I'm not saying Pilate is innocent, but what I am saying is he was absolutely manipulated. And those Jews knew exactly what they were doing. The leaders. The crowd may not have even known what was going on. And certainly the rest of the town and the gathered Jews, in the camp on the other side, they wouldn't have heard about this until it was too late, until he was already on the cross. And so we want to be careful that we don't start saying, the Jews killed Jesus, as has been said many times through history and has led to all sorts of anti-Semitism. In a sense, yeah, they did. But it was really the authorities. It was the leaders that manipulated the whole situation. And so we come to the end, and I just put this quote. I didn't fast forward through those. Here's a little quote here. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all end with a poignant contrast. Vile, dangerous, and guilty Barabbas, the son of some father or other, was released, while innocent Jesus, the son of the Father, was led out to be scourged and crucified. The great exchange. The greatest travesty of justice, the evil plan of the Jewish leadership, the great salvation plan of eternity. You see, when you take your time through the trials and you work your way through all six, there's something, I think, more powerful about this than just fast forward like we have to do in a sermon. That's why we've taken this time to walk our way through it. And obviously, I would love to be able to continue on and say, let's look at the cross. Let's go into detail with the 4 accounts of the cross, and let's go on to the resurrection. That would be an awesome seminar. We would still be sat here tomorrow morning, and people would wonder why we look so tired. So we're not going to do that. Instead, we're just going to focus on the bit that gets skipped. Because of the awkwardness of the calendar, we go from Palm Sunday to Resurrection Sunday, and sometimes we pause on Good Friday. Thankfully, we pause on Good Friday every week in the breaking of bread. That's the reason for that, to make sure we don't forget. But what I thought would be really helpful today would be to think about the trials and to recognize the injustice, to recognize the manipulation and the power and all the kind of deceit and corruption of the whole thing. But way more than that, to recognize how Jesus handled himself. This was no accident. This was no kind of courtroom scene that got out of hand. Jesus was in charge when he spoke with Annas. In fact, Jesus was in charge in the Garden of Gethsemane. In fact, Jesus was in charge in the upper room. In fact, Jesus was in charge of going to Jerusalem in the first place. John 11, when Thomas is saying, what are we doing going up to Jerusalem? Let's go up and get killed with him. They knew. I mean, it was getting through that Jesus was going to the cross. They hadn't quite put it all together, but he knew. And so Jesus was in charge all the way through the Gospels. And once you get into the trials, face to face with Annas, Jesus is the boss. Face to face with Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin, Jesus is in charge. He gives them the charge they need to finish the proceedings. First thing in the morning when he's brought to the daybreak council, he gives them the Psalm 110 quote. That's what you need? I'll give you a political one. Trial with Pilate, he's in charge. He's having a conversation with Pilate in a way that Pilate was never used to having before. When Pilate sends him off to Herod, Jesus is in charge. Doesn't play games, doesn't do tricks. He'll take the beating, and he does that multiple times, but the one thing he doesn't do is cower or panic or beg or any of the things that any normal human would do. Because he's in charge, and when he comes back to Pilate, Pilate is panicked. And you've got the great authority of Jerusalem outside and the great authority of Rome represented by this man Pilate inside. And yet who's the authority? It's that man Jesus, who's completely in charge of the whole proceedings. You wouldn't have any authority over me unless it had been given to you. And I'm going to decide who bears the greater guilt. Jesus was in charge at every step of those 6 trials. And so as we come to a close, we're going to finish on time, and if you have follow-up comments and stuff, we can chat more after or tomorrow. But just in order to finish on time, let's just think about this question. Who killed Jesus? Well, I suppose we could say the Jews killed Jesus. And in one sense, we'd be right. The authorities certainly manipulated the whole situation, and they pushed for it. They rejected the one that they pierced. One day, they'll look on him whom they've pierced. One day, all Israel will be saved. And it will come, I believe, at a moment in the unfolding of future events where it suddenly dawns on them what they did. That's going to be an incredibly special moment. And so that's coming. And so in a sense, we can say, yes, the Jews killed Jesus. We've got to be careful how we say that, because it's very easy to trigger all sorts of unhelpful racial comments, stereotypes, and so on. And being called Jesus killers or Messiah killers has been part of the stigma that Jewish people have had to carry before very unkind humanity for many years. So let's be a bit more precise. It was the authorities in that time, really, that manipulated the situation. So there's truth to it, but it's certainly not the whole truth. You could say the Romans killed Jesus. Yep. Absolutely. It was a Roman cross. It was Roman soldiers. It was the Roman prefect who made the decree. It was a Roman execution with the inscription written in 3 languages, including Latin, because this was Roman business. So yeah, the Romans did kill Jesus. But if we stuck with, is it the Jewish fault or the Roman fault, we would be doing something purely historical. And biblically, even though the Bible is absolutely historical, the goal of the Bible is far more theological and even devotional. And so what would the theological and the devotional answer be? Who killed Jesus? Well, I think we could honestly say, well, I did. Because Jesus was on a mission, and he was on a mission to take care of my sin and your sin. Right? He knew what was in front of him. He endured the cross for the joy set before him, it says in Hebrews. But he was absolutely aware that God was making him who knew no sin to be sin for us. And so if we're Christians, we cannot have a discussion about Jews versus Romans and not say, hold on a second. Yes and yes, but bigger yes is right here. It was me. It was my sin that took him to the cross. It was my sin that drove him through all of that. And who killed Jesus? The Father. God killed Jesus. It was God's plan. And it's awkward to say God killed Jesus. But it's not awkward theologically to recognize that it pleased the Father to do this. It was a devastating thing. Heartbreaking thing. This was not some kind of angry, distant God just doing some kind of cosmic child abuse on his son, as some people have badly stated it. No, this was the plan of God in his justice, in his love, to take upon himself, right at the core of his own being, the punishment for our sin. And so it was God's plan. God's plan since the beginning of the world, even before that, for the Lamb of God to be slain. And so we've got to put all that together, and that's a theological seminar that you should, by all means, spend a lot of time chasing through your epistles and, your New Testament and your Old Testament and see how this is the plan of God being unfolded. Because until we recognize this was God's plan, and until we recognize that was my sin, this will only be a historical seminar. But once we realize, no, this is God's plan because of my sin, it becomes a theological seminar, it becomes a devotional seminar, and it should stir within us a response of trust, of praise, of worship, of adoration. Jesus knew what he was doing, and he did it for us. Let's pray. Father, some of us have known this reality for decades. Some of us have been your people in your family for a very long time, and maybe there's nothing new in anything that we've said, but we just want to say thank you. Just a simple thank you for this privilege of spending time just soaking in the truth of what happened. And Lord, we pray that you'd forgive us for the ways that our hearts grow cold to this. Forgive us for the ways that we get caught up with life and work and sport and politics and all the kind of stuff that's swirling around us, and somehow we think that what's visible before our eyes is more significant than what happened back in those days, back that night and that day on that cross. Lord, I pray that you would let the cross, let your plan, let your heart become bigger in our eyes, so that we never lose the wonder of what you've done for us. We don't understand it. Even if we can explain it, we don't understand it. Why you would go through that for us. But we thank you, Father, for sending your Son. We thank you, Jesus, for going through all that you went through, every strike, every lash of the whip, every moment of that agonizing night and day. Lord, we just bow before you and say thank you. We love you. We pray that the reality of that first Easter would cast a wonderful shadow over every part of our lives, that we would live in the light of that, in the light of who you are, for the rest of today and tomorrow and the days ahead. We fall so far short. We mess up so much, but we know that that's why you did it, because we're sinners and we need you. And so we acknowledge that freely, and we bow the knee before you, and we bow our hearts before you, and we just admit, Lord, we are sinners and we need you. Thank you that you've done everything for us. We give you praise and we give you worship in Jesus' name. Amen.